everyone, I welcome you all to the live session on ReactJS full course by Intellipaat. This session is conducted by multiple experts who will be teaching you all about ReactJS from basic to advanced level. In this session, we have also covered hands-on demo, projects and also interview questions and answers. But before we begin the session, make sure to subscribe to our channel and also hit on the bell icon so that you will never miss an update from us. Begin with Introduction to ReactJS. Then after that, we will explain you about DOM and virtual DOM. Then later on, we will see the difference between class, functions and components. Once we finish that, we will teach you about React hooks and also do a quick hands-on on how to build custom hooks. Post that, we will be learning about ReactJS Bootstrap. Once we finish that, we will be doing hands-on demo on creating class components and function components. Once we finish all the hands-on demo, we will be telling you the difference between AngularJS and ReactJS. Post that, we will be learning about how to become ReactJS developer. Then finally, we will be covering ReactJS interview questions and answers. So, this is the agenda of the video. This video is going to be very interesting, so stay tuned and watch the video till the end. Now, let's begin the session.
What is ReactJS? We'll try and demystify what ReactJS is and why is it important for us to understand what it actually means. Why ReactJS is so popular is something we'll take a look at afterwards, but firstly we'll have to understand what ReactJS is all about. So ReactJS is a UI library. UI stands for user interface. So it's a user interface library that allows developers to build small self-contained UI components which can be used to build a user interface. So whenever you take a look at a user interface of any application, whether it's a web application, mobile application, desktop application, you will see that it's built using some components. These components are repeated all over the platforms. So even on an Android mobile, these components may be repeated. So the components could be a button, it could be a text field, an editable text field, a table view, it could be an image carousel in which you can take a look at all the images that are available by swiping on them or clicking on the arrow buttons. It could also be some image gallery and all of that. And many of these components are built by grouping together smaller components. So a good example of this is a form. A form which is used to collect users' information is built by grouping smaller components together. Components such as text field, input field, submit button, and labels and things like that. So ReactJS allows us to write JavaScript code that allows us to build these components. These components can then be arranged in a hierarchy structure in which we define where does a particular component go declaratively, and using that we can build up the entire user interface. The user interface built using ReactJS is built completely using JavaScript. So we don't have to understand and define how you can use these components. We just need to define what these components look like, what their styles is going to be, and how they are going to interact with the events that the user dispatches. So when the user clicks on a particular component, what should happen and should something happen or not, things like that. So React allows developers to write really declarative code in JavaScript to efficiently assemble together a user interface. So thing is that what React allows us to do is that it allows us to declare our user interface rather than imperatively dispatching commands that lets the browser know how to piece together the user interface. So React allows us to just declare, okay, I need a button, I need inside the button I need some text, and the text should be this. Instead of us having to create a button from scratch and then assigning some text to the text field and stuff like that. If you have dealt with the old school DOM manipulation way, which we'll cover in a few moments, is how it works in DOM generally is you have to create these components or elements yourself. Then you have to edit their attributes and you have to add the children attributes. Once you've done all of that, you have to assemble them together in a tree-like structure, which is the DOM tree or document object model tree, in which you have all the child components and parent components efficiently rendered together. So you have to create like a form. Inside a form, you have to attach all the text fields and labels. You have to associate labels with the text fields. You have the input fields. You have to associate types with them. So for instance, some input fields can have passwords. Some input fields can have email. Some input fields can have numbers in a particular range, and so on and so forth. So that's how we're supposed to do that. Keeping that in mind, when we declare our code using ReactJS, it feels like we're writing HTML, but that's not what we're doing, which we'll cover in a later segment. But that was one of the major controversies with React when it released. So if you've seen some code in React, you can see it as being written HTML with CSS and JavaScript, which is not exactly how it's working. So we'll cover that as well. So it allows us to create user interfaces using just JavaScript and writing the user interface code very declaratively. We do have to create the markup for our components so that our components understand what is it we're trying to display, fancy button or something like that. Also, React.js is maintained by Facebook and were released in 2013. Sorry. So as you can see, React.js has been out for quite a while, and there have been some massive advancements in the development of React. Currently, React.js is in its 16th version and 17th version is being released. React.js is by far one of the most popular user interface libraries. It has overtaken Angular and Vue in popularity and in job requirements as well. React.js is very popular because it's very simple. It's very easy to understand and it's very easy to learn and use as well. Now, when I say easy, I don't necessarily mean simple. There is a sufficient mental model shift that you need to understand. If you worked with the old school way of creating DOM elements and then updating those DOM elements and then inserting the data, that is going to be difficult in this scenario. So we'll have to take a look at that. But overall, it works fine. So in conclusion, what React.js is that it's a user interface library that allows us to build user interfaces by declaratively writing JavaScript code. The JavaScript code is maintained by React. So if any changes happen to the thing that we have rendered, all the components, React will take care of assembling those components, re-rendering the changes, and making sure everything is done as efficiently as possible. If React was not there, then we would have to write the code to figure out what are the things that we have to change. And once we do change, then we have to display it to the user, and that's about it. And that's how it's supposed to work. And now let's take a look at what else we have. What is DOM? We've been talking a lot about DOM and how React.js keeps everything in sync with the DOM, but we'll try and understand what DOM actually means. DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it's the tree structure of our HTML components, but we'll try and get a bit deeper into it. So DOM actually stands for Document Object Model. That I think we all knew. It is a tree-like structure that is used to represent the structure of all the elements of an HTML document. So when we create an HTML document with all the markup, the tags, the attributes, and all of that, it creates a tree-like structure in which HTML tag is at the top. Then we have the body tag, which is its child node. Then we have the head tag, which is also the child node of HTML tag, and it has a lot of information about the content of our website, such as the SEO related stuff, the style sheets, and so on. So these are all arranged in a tree structure. Now, why in a tree structure? Because it makes it very easy for us to navigate from the top of our HTML tag to the particular element that we're interested in, and we can manipulate it in Java. We can manipulate it by getting a reference to it. We can manipulate it by, after getting a reference to it, we can manipulate it by changing its attributes, its content, its type. There could be a number of things that we can do. And that allows us to manipulate it on the fly. So when we click a button and we want to make some changes to our page's HTML content, we can do it using manipulating the DOM. So DOM creates a hierarchical structure. As a tree structure is a hierarchical structure that we have parent and child and sibling and grandparent and all that. And in that, what it does is that DOM can be used by programming languages like JavaScript to interact and manipulate. Now, it can be used by JavaScript, but that's not the only language that can use it. For instance, if you're into web scraping, then you can take a look at Python, Beautiful Soup, and they also understand the document object model. And you can just traverse the structure of the tree once you understand the structure. And with that structure, you can pinpoint to the content that you want to manipulate or save, and you can do that. Now, DOM is a standard interface for interacting with web pages using programming or scripting languages. So it's not that DOM is something that people haven't used yet. People use DOM all the time, and it's a standard programming interface. So anyone who interacts with the web page, who tries to get data from a web page, converts the HTML string into the DOM structure and then manipulates it the way they want to. The reason why JavaScript does it is because exactly the kind of thing that it was built to do. JavaScript was created so that it can manipulate and add functionality to web pages. As times grew, though, JavaScript's reach of what it could do became even more, and now JavaScript can do a whole lot more than just manipulate the DOM. But it's still one of its major features and one of the major reasons why we use DOM, right? So now let's take a look at what else we have to do. Now let's take a look at React DOM. We've taken a look at what DOM is, but when we're working with React in the browser, we need to also work with React DOM, which is one of the libraries that React uses underneath the hood. Let's take a look at what it is and why do we need to use it. So React is a user interface library, but it's built with the purpose of building user interfaces. It's not limited to web. It could also be extended to be used on mobile applications or virtual reality applications such as React VR or React Native, not in that order. But you can use React to build applications for the web, for the mobile platform, which could be cross-platform such as Android and iOS. And you can also use it to build applications for virtual reality apps. Now, that being said, how can you build such applications for such different platforms when you have a single library? Well, the answer is that they have separated the essential parts from the variable parts. So when we're using it on the web, that is when we're using it to build the front end of the web application that we are going to be building, then it needs to interact with the DOM. To make that interaction easy and make that integration seamless, we use React DOM. So what React DOM will do, it will take a look at our component tree and it will take care of converting that component tree into DOM elements and keep track of managing that component. So we can create the components using React, and then when it comes to integrating our components with the actual web DOM, we can basically just use React DOM and it will take care of it all for us. That's what React DOM actually is. React DOM is nothing more than just a library. Now, it's basically just a package that contains DOM specific methods used by React to enable itself to interact with the DOM. So if you're using React and you want to build applications for the web, then you use React DOM. Other libraries such as React Native and React VR have their own bridging system, so you don't have to worry about that at all. All you have to worry about is how you can build user interfaces using DOM or React DOM in that specific scenario. So all React DOM does is that it bridges the gap between the React user interface library and the web DOM platform. So if you want to build React applications by creating components that can then be translated into DOM elements and managed by React, we use React DOM specifically for that purpose. Now let's take a look at UI without React.js. So when you're building user interface without React.js, what are the kinds of things that you need to tackle? The first thing is decomposition. So we can quite easily build user interfaces without React.js. So if you want to build a user interface without React.js, you can do it. Especially for smaller applications, it's also a recommended way that you go without React.js. But for any reasonably sized application, it involves some really difficult challenges. One of those challenges is decomposition. So when you're using React.js, we can create small isolated individual components which can then be composed together to create the entire user interface. So if you have a user interface that you want to create using React.js, you can do so. But without React.js, creating smaller components, combining which you can create a larger user interface can be really difficult. Whereas with React.js, decomposition is really easy. So that's why React.js is much more preferred over other component libraries. So without React.js, we would need to create the HTML tags, then use the JavaScript to add event handling code and wire everything up. So without React.js, what we do in plain JavaScript is firstly we create the HTML code for our user interface, style it using CSS. Then we get a handle to each of the components that we're interested in, such as if we are interested in knowing when a button is clicked and all of that. We get those user interface elements, and then we add some user interface elements, add some event handling code to it. So if we have a button that we want to respond to when it's clicked on, what we can do is we can just create an on-click handler which will run when the button is clicked on. Now the browser takes care of it all. When the user clicks on the button, the event code that we have associated with the event handling code will run. This is quite easy in theory, but in practice it's really difficult because when we have multiple user interface elements and their interaction needs to be configured simultaneously, separating these concerns can be really difficult. How do you separate the event handling code of a button from an event handling code of another button, which are two different buttons, such as the submit and the reset buttons of a form? So that could be really difficult, and when that difficulty is something that we need to manage on medium to large size applications, it could be really difficult as well. So that is why decomposition comes into play, where we can just create self-contained isolated components, and those components will take care of their own logic. They don't need to worry about how other components are working. And we don't have to go through the entire DOM hunting for each element and then assigning the behavior that needs to happen when the user clicks on a button or some other aspect of the application happens. Then comes state management. State management is one of the most important aspects in any application, not just front-end applications. But it is especially important when we are dealing with front-end applications or applications that the users can see. The reason being that state refers to the data that our application stores in the memory. So that data can be used to display things later. For instance, when we are building a chat application, the messages that you have sent so far and the messages that you are going to send right now that you have typed into the chat box, all of these are part of the state of the application. This is managed by your application. And now your application needs to take that data, save it to the database, send it to the user. The user needs to be able to see it. When the user sees it, that notification needs to be sent out to all the other users who are associated with the messages as well. And that could be a really complicated task. With that in mind, what we can do as developers is we need to firstly understand how to use state. So state management is really, really difficult. Mainly because if you have an application that has some data that is useful for one component and some data that's useful for other component, and then there's some data that needs to be shared between those components, that is really difficult because now we have to figure out where to put that data so that it can be easily shared by child components and so on. So that's really difficult, especially in an event-driven design such as the one that we saw earlier with plain JavaScript and HTML. Because if you're doing things like this, then what's going to happen is we're going to be able to just do state management. We're going to be able to do state management based on user interfaces event system. So when we get a click, then we are going to update something. Then we're going to make some changes to the state. But all the data that we need is going to be stored eventually in a larger global context, in a global object. All the variables that live on a global object, that's going to be really difficult to manage because some part of our application not knows what are the different names of the variables that are giving the information that we need, will end up overriding those variables and all the other parts of our application will start breaking. And that will be really difficult for us to figure out how that is happening. So that's why state management is really important. Now, sometimes when data is being displayed, it gets changed or updated. So if you have data, let's say you have chat application, the data that you have is all the messages that you have so far when you load the application, and new data will be when the user sends a new message, updates previous messages if they have the ability to do so, and so on and so on. So the total price that is shown on a shopping cart when another item is added also changes the total price of the entire cart. So when you add new elements, the total price needs to change as well, and many different aspects of the application need to update the data, and that is all very difficult. So this is where state management comes into play, where we can specify local state. Local state basically means just the piece of information that only one of our components is interested in and they only need to know. So for instance, if we have an application that fetches data from the external web APIs and displays images, well, the individual components are only responsible for fetching data from each of the user interface elements and getting the images from the web server and then displaying it into the user interface element. So this is why state management is important, and simpler user interfaces without React.js, managing state, defining local state so that if we define some other state variable with the same name doesn't get overridden, can be really complicated, which is why we use React.js instead of plain user interface without React. Now, React takes care of keeping all the data and the display in sync with each other. So if the data is changed, all components being displayed are updated automatically. So if you are not using React, then you have to take care of where all the state that we are using is being referenced, and then we need to update it one by one, and that could be difficult. So adding and removing elements from a DOM tree is very performance intensive task. Now, this is what causes a lot of performance hit in a lot of our applications that we build. Whenever we add and remove or completely delete the entire DOM tree structure and then rebuild all the components that haven't even changed, that could be difficult. Unless we are very smart about it and we keep a track of what is being rendered. If that is the case, then it's not really difficult. So in situations like this, we end up using React.js because it gives us a massive performance boost. What React does is that it takes care of rendering the user interface without us having to muddle through the entire user interface's code, without us having to figure out what are the things that need to be removed and what are the things that need to be added and what is the best way to do it. React will just do it automatically for us. That's why React.js is so popular. Now, React solves this problem by something called a virtual DOM, which we'll discuss later on. Now, virtual DOM allows us to make updates to the components, and then the React will take care of matching the updated virtual DOM with the current actual DOM and figure out what are the things that need to be changed. It basically diffs the entire DOM and figures out what are the differences. The differences that are found are updated, and only the differences are updated. Other things are just left as they are, and that's the way it works. Finally, it comes to debugging. Whenever we're building an application that is using the user interface, it could be really difficult to us to debug this application. Debugging basically means if you run into an error, how are we going to solve it? The way we solve it usually is by going through console log statements, figuring out where the error has come from, taking a look through stack traces, but they are not really reliable ways of debugging an application. There are advanced ways as well, and you can use IDEs for that, but the tools for debugging JavaScript applications are not that good. Keeping that in mind, in React, we have React Developer tools. And what they allow us to do is they allow us to, once we're in development mode and we have installed the React Developer Tools extension, greatly simplifies our component debugging. We can display components, we can take a look at the internal state, we can take a look at the props, where they are being passed from, at what level are the changes to state are being dispatched. There are many things that we can do, and all of that is very useful. So as you can see, React is so popular because it allows us to do these things. Now let's take a look at some of the ES6 features that are necessary for us to use in React.js, or in order to learn React.js we need to know. So let's take a look at that. So React.js recommends using ES6 features to create more readable and more concise code. Now a few of the most important ES6 features are the ones that we're going to discuss now. ES6 basically refers to ES 2015. ES stands for ECMAScript. It is basically JavaScript, but it has been standardized. So new recommendations are proposed, and then browsers implement those recommendations, and that keeps evolving. And those recommendations are given by the ECMAScript Recommendation Society. So that's how we do that. So this is why we use the ES6 features, because new recommendations were proposed in 2015. Those have been implemented and are now widely supported, and they let us write really clean and concise code. So the first thing is variable declaration. Now in ES6 we can use let or const variables and to describe variables and constant values in JavaScript. Before ES6 we would have to use the var keyword, var, which allows us to describe variables, but there were certain issues with var. If we were to define a variable inside a loop, it would still leak out to and be available outside the loop inside functions. That was really difficult for us to understand, and that led to a lot of issues. This was called variable hoisting, and that led to a lot of undesirable effects. This is why we ended up using let and const, and that's why they are most important. Then comes arrow functions. So arrow functions are used to write anonymous functions in a very concise way without using the function keyword. So when we're using arrow functions, all we have to do is we have to use the simple syntax. Instead of writing anonymous function with the function keyword and just not giving it a name, but the whole single brackets, all the element names, and then double curly brackets, what we would have to do is we would, for arrow functions, all we have to do is create arrow like syntax, and that will work. And we'll take a look at the syntax just in a moment.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of React.js by answering this question. What is React.js? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
Then came classes. Now, classes are the fundamental construct of an object-oriented programming language, such as Python, Ruby, Java, C Sharp, C++. All of them have the keyword class associated there. But in JavaScript, the keyword was not present. In order to create a class, you would have to firstly create a function, which is called the constructor function, then create a new object out of that function and add things to its prototype. That was really difficult for people to understand. So what they have done is they have created, instead of creating functions, we now can use class keyword and just use classes the regular way, and that works just fine. And then comes array destructuring. So what destructuring allows us to do is it allows us to get the variables out of objects and arrays. So if we have an array with three elements, that we know are going to be three, and we want to get these three variables out into three variables. Instead of assigning them one by one, we can do it all in one line using this destructuring. Same with objects. So if we have objects that are key value pairs, we can do the same thing with objects as well. So that's why we do restructuring, and it's a concept that's available in many other languages as well. We'll take a look at the advantages that you can use to use React.js, the advantages that you get when you're using React.js. What are the advantages that you should be looking for when you're using React.js? So when we're using React.js, it provides us with several advantages. The first one is scalability. So React.js works well with applications of all sizes. If you've built React.js applications, you've built simple small applications like to-do list applications to really giant e-commerce applications. A really good example of this is going to be Flipkart, because they have built their entire front end using React.js, and it's scalable because we can see that their front end is working quite well. So you can build applications using React.js for smaller applications to applications that are of giant size. Another example of disadvantage would be Facebook. The company that has created React.js has built more than 100,000 of UI components that are being used in Facebook. Instagram also uses React.js, and many other front ends of the online websites that are of the giant scale use React.js. So it's quite scalable in that regard. When it comes to compositional UI, compositional UI basically means that it allows us to combine our user interface elements or smaller user interface elements that are usable into other user interfaces, and then we can modify the things that can be modified and replace the user interface elements if needed. So we can just pick and choose the user interface elements that we want to combine in our front end, and we can easily do it by importing the component, then rendering it, and then changing its behavior if it's possible and if necessary. So that's why we use compositional UI as one of the advantages. Then comes portability. Portability is one of the major advantages of React.js, mainly because a component can be ported from one project to other project without much hassle. If I have a project in which I have created a button component and I want it to be used in my other project as well, all I have to do is just import the button component and then display it on the screen, declaratively creating the markup. Nothing more than that I have to do. If I want to configure it, then there's a bit more work to be done, obviously. But for simple usages, it's very easy to do. So that's why portability is one of the major advantages of using React.js, and that's why many people use React.js, because it's very, very portable. Portability also helps across devices. So if you're using React.js on the web and you want to use it for your native mobile application, there are some components that you can carry over, not all, because the environments are so different and the platforms are so different. But if you want to, you can just create the styles for one component and then at least can share the styles for those components across different user interfaces. So that's usable. And then comes performant. So React.js is very performant. What it allows us to do is it allows us to, instead of accessing real browser DOM, allows us to use virtual DOM. That virtual DOM can then be used in order to boost the performance when it comes to DOM manipulation. If we were doing it with the virtual DOM, then there would be a lot of issues. The performance would be really cumbersome, it would be really clunky, the user interface would lag at certain points, and that would be really difficult for us to get started with. So we don't have to worry about that. That will work just fine. And now we are done with the advantages. Let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at some of the disadvantages of using React.js. So React.js is a library, but it's not free. So there are going to be some consequences of using it. So it's better to be advised of what the disadvantages might be. The first thing is its learning curve. Although it's quite easy to pick up the learning curve, the number of things that you have to learn in order to become a React.js developer are going to be quite a large number. Also, there's a big mental shift in the way you look at applications. So earlier we used to build applications by creating the markup, then getting the user interface elements, and then attaching event handlers to perform some tasks on it. Now we need to change that kind of thinking to applications being a function of our markup and our state. So the markup will be what our application should look like, and state would be the data that our application holds. So if the user logs out of the application, what are the things that need to change? If the user deletes a particular message, what are the number of things that need to change? That's the kind of thinking we need to adopt when we're building applications, and that could be a little difficult to understand right at the beginning. So a lot of practice is needed in order to get understanding how to build applications like that. Then comes documentation. So React.js rolls out updates and new features quite fast. So every now and then new features, new updates, new experimental features are available as well, and old features are removed, new features are added with different syntax than the experimental one. Lots of changes are happening quite fast. So because of this, online documentation, tutorials might not be up to date. Some new ways of doing things that are much more efficient might have come out. Maybe there are patterns that allow us to build our applications in a much more robust way, but we can't use those patterns right now because we don't know those patterns because they have been discovered recently and we're not aware of them. So documentation isn't always up to date. The tutorials aren't always up to date. There are new things that are happening every now and then. So it could be really difficult and frustrating, especially for a beginner. Then comes JSX. So JSX is the extension to the JavaScript language that allows us to write HTML stack, which allows us to declaratively describe our user interface. And React will take care of creating that user interface and displaying it to the user. So what happens is, to work with React, we need to learn how to use JSX. JSX is not the easiest thing to learn, especially when you come from plain JavaScript background where you're supposed to separate JavaScript into a separate file and HTML to a separate file. When you look at JSX code, it looks a bit funny. It looks a bit difficult to understand. It looks like we're breaking some commonly used good patterns like not mixing your JavaScript and HTML. That could be a little tough. Then comes state management. Now, depending on how your application is structured, managing the state of your application is among one of the most difficult aspects of React applications. If you want to manage state, you need to understand where does a particular piece of information needs to go in your component tree. So if you, for instance, if you have some list of users that need to be displayed and they have certain properties, but those properties are needed by other components as well, you need to find the lowest possible common ancestor and put the data there. It's called lifting up the state. So these are the kind of things that we need to understand. We need to be very cognizant of where a particular piece of information is going to live in our application component tree and how we are going to be able to use it. So that could be a little tough. Again, it's also a shift in the mental model, which could be very difficult to understand right at the beginning. But overall, it's quite easy to understand once you get the hang of it. And now let's take a look at how we can create our own applications that performs DOM manipulation. So I have an empty folder here. What I will do is I will open it up in my code editor. You can use any code editor that you want. I'll create two files. Let's close this one. First one is called index.html. Alright. So this is an HTML file. Alright. And inside the file, the first thing I want to do is I want to right, and there's a button with the ID of add button, and finally an unordered list. Yeah. And it should have an ID of list. So I save it, and after saving it, I have it saved and created in my application or in my Explorer. Now all I have to do is I want to open it up, and this is what it looks like. So I need to add some text in the button. So this is what it looks like. Now if I want to create a new file, I can just create it, name it script.js, and finally I have to add it in my HTML code. So now that is done and we have our script. Now I need to get all the things, right? Firstly I need the list. So I just use document.get element by ID, and the ID that we gave to the list is list. Alright, that's done. Now I need the button, so I need to do the same thing. Now what I want to do is I want to create a variable named index. I'll show you why. Now button, which is the button on our page, dot add event listener. So when I click on the event, what I want to happen is I want to create an element. So I'll just create equals to document dot create element. That element needs what kind of element I want to create. It's just an li, which is a list item. Now element dot text content is going to be task hashtag plus index plus plus. So it will be task 1, task 2, task 3, and so on and so forth. And now all I have to do is I have to append it as a child element to my list. So I save it, go back, fresh, yeah, click on add, and as you can see, I'm able to manipulate the DOM. And to make sure that this is what's happening, I open the source code. As you can see, there are no list items inside the list. I can open my developer tools here as well. Click here. This is the body tag. This is the list. It's empty. Click on add. Something's added to the list. This is the task with the new tag. Add new, and as you can see, I can add them one by one, and it's working completely fine. So that's how you can do that. Now let's take a look at what else we have.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides ReactJS online training mentored by industry experts. The course link is given in the description below. Now, let's continue with the session.
We will now build a user interface without React. So this would be us performing DOM queries on ourselves, and we'll be using plain JavaScript, and you can see how tedious it is. So this is what we have right now. And if I open the folder that I have created things in, this is what it looks like. I have a simple React.js application or a simple front-end application without React.js. All it has is a script file and an index.html file with the main tag. And now we want to build the user interface inside it. So we will be using the code that we write inside our script tag. So for that, we'll need to create a few functions. We want to display an h1 tag with the text UI without React as being displayed, so that you can understand how difficult it might be. Let's take a look at that. So what we'll do is we'll create a function render. Render will take children, and what we will do is we'll create our app, and for that we need document.getElement by ID, and the ID is main. The main is basically a div inside which our entire application will live. App.append child children. That's all we need to do here. Now we need to create a few functions that we can compose with each other. First function I'll create is for creating an h1. It will also take children, and what it will do is it will firstly create an element. H1 is what we want to create, so we do that element dot, and what we want to do is we want to append the child, and then return element. Finally, we want some text content to be displayed, so for that we need to create function named text. This will also take some content that we need to display. So now all we have to do is we need to return document.create text node with the content that we have provided. And now all we have to do is we need to compose these functions with each other. We need to call the render function. We want to create an h1. Inside the h1 we need to pass in the text. The text would be UI without React. Save it. After manually writing all those functions and creating everything, if we rerun our app, I think we've run into some issues. We run into the console and everything is working fine. Inside the body tag, we have forgotten to link our script file as far as I can see. So all I have to do now is just type script src script.js, and since it's the same file, and now it's working completely fine. So as you can see, if we don't include our JavaScript, then it won't work. And we have a div tag with an h1 tag, and the h1 tag contains the text content UI without React. So that's how you can build a user interface, a really simple one without using React. However, as you can see that we have to plumb together all these components and figure out how to get things done. That could be really cumbersome. Now let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at some of the new ES6 features that we have discussed thus far. We'll try and understand what these features are and what they look like and how they compare to the old syntax. So for that, all I've done, I've created an HTML page. I have created this is the HTML page. It has nothing but a reference to a script file and a console. that I have opened. This is the HTML page. It has nothing, just the basic HTML skeleton and the script.js reference. And every code that we write will be written here. So let's first understand our variables using let and const. So the things that we have to understand are let and const are the first one. So what we do is if I create a block, so if I create variables inside a block, inside an if statement, let's say, so x is equals to 1, y is equals to 2, and z is equals to 3. So if I try to console log them outside my if statement, although I've declared them inside the if statement, they should not be available outside. Look what happens. As you can see, they are available. In fact, I can put them inside my console as well. So the reason why that happens is because of a feature in JavaScript called hoisting. What hoisting does is that it takes all of the variables and the function declarations that we have created, no matter how deeply nested they are, and it gets bubbled up to the top. So now it's available everywhere we want to use it. The reason that happens is because if we declare a function, let's say I declare a function named function a app, right? And inside it I have written whatever I want to do, and I call it before I have declared it. Now that would have been an error because my application knows nothing about it. But if I have done it using hoisting, then it knows that okay, this is a function, I'm going to bring it when it tries to interpret it, brings everything at the top, and then tries doing things. But it doesn't make sense with the variables, and that causes a lot of issues. So to solve this scoping issue, developers of these languages came up with an idea. The variable is going to be there. We can create one for let, and we can create one for const. Now if I run this, as you can see, y is not defined. If I remove x and y here, sorry, y and z, just use x, it's available. Now what is the difference between let and const? Both of them are scoped to a particular scope, but what the difference is this dot log and let x is equals to 10, const y is equals to 11, right? And now if I print x plus plus, it works. So now the value of x is 11 after I printed it. I can also do it the other way, plus plus x, and that works. Now if I were to do it this way, it's going to give me an error. Assignment to a constant variable. So I can't change the value assigned to a constant variable. That is the only difference. So which one should you use? I recommend that you choose const as much as you can, because if you use const, then there's no way that someone who is using your code can end up changing it and changing variables that your application depends on if they are not allowed. Only when you explicitly need to change a variable, use let. So with that, we have come to the other part of it, which is us creating arrow functions. This is done. I'm going to delete it all. Now comes arrow. Arrow function basically allows us to create functions in a single line. So if I want to create a function, right, and what that function is supposed to do is it's supposed to print something. So let's say that I'm creating a function, perform, okay, and then we have milliseconds, and then we have a callback function, right? This is pretty standard so far. Set timeout. I'm going to simulate a delay for the milliseconds and then execute callback. So handler and then timeout. So callback and then millisecond. Now what will happen is if I call the perform task function, pass in 1000 milliseconds, and I pass in the function, I have to create a new function with all the syntax, and then I have to write console dot log done. Run this, wait for a second, and then everything's done. But I can also do it in one other way, which is I can use arrow functions. Inside arrow functions, I can keep the function body to be the same, and I can remove these things. So now all I have to do is create an arrow. As you can see, I can do it in a single line, run it, and then it's done. So what's happening is I'm just defining the list of parameters that I want. If I have some parameters, I can pass it here as well. But since I don't, I'm not going to be passing it. And then a single line of function, I can do it this way. If, for instance, it's a multiple line function, then I can wrap it in curly braces and do it whatever I want to do with it. As you can see, it still looks more concise than using the whole function syntax. So that's why we use arrow functions. Arrow functions are more concise way of writing code. Right. Now we move on to classes. So classes are, these are the classes. In old school JavaScript, we had to firstly create a function. Let me call it app. This would be my class. Inside my function, I would console log constructor. So this is the constructor function. And now I have to add things to the prototype. Prototype dot say hello is going to be equal to a function. And that function is going to log hello. Right? So I can create a function. Const object is equals to app. But since it's a class, I have to use new keyword. So I create a new class, which is an object. Now after creating the object, all I have to do is say hello. Now if I run this, first the constructor function gets called, then hello function gets called. Now same thing I can write using class. The changes I have to make is just class app constructor and instead of doing it this way, all I have to do is wrap all of this, and this should work similarly. Refresh it, as you can see constructor and hello. So everything's working completely fine. This is just syntactic sugar. And now if I want to create subclasses and superclasses, all I have to do is I can just since base app. If I had a class named base app, I don't, but this is how you would do it. On the other hand, on all school syntax where we used function, we would have to do assigning the prototype, extending the prototype, and there would be a lot of tricky situations. So we don't do that. Finally, we have destructuring, which is one of the newest and one of the most used features. Destructuring, and what it allows us to do. So let's say that I have a variable names A, B, and C. Now I want A to be assigned to a variable named X, B to be assigned to a variable named Y, C to be assigned to a variable named Z. To do this, I would have to then go const X is equals to names of 0, Y is equals to names of 1, and finally Z is equals to names of 2. Now if I console log X, Y, and Z, and I run this, ABC is there. But as you can see, this is just a lot of code for something so simple. So instead what I can do is I can use the destructuring syntax. And now if I run this, it's working just the same. So what's happening is it's saying, okay, this is a variable. The variable at the first index goes in X. Second index goes in Y. Third index goes in Z. If there are other variables as well, they will be ignored. So that's how you can destructure an array. So what about objects? So let's say that I have person, right? And they have name as John and country as England. Now, if I want to create two variables named name and country to be assigned with the variables with the keys of names and countries, what I want to do is earlier I would have to create const name is equals to person.name. That and similarly for country. But here, all I can do is I can just use name, country, and now if I want to log name and country, I can do so quite easily. Fresh, everything's working as expected. That's how you destructure things. These are called syntactic sugars, basically because they just do things in a different way. They're not changing the performance, they're not changing anything underneath the hood. They just allow that with a more convenient way of describing the things that we want the language to perform. So that's why we do that. So with that in mind, let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at virtual DOM or VDOM as it's called. Virtual DOM or VDOM is one of the fundamental concepts that React uses to keep the application performing. How does it work and what does it actually mean to use a virtual DOM? So let's take a look at that. In React.js, virtual DOM is just an ideal. So it's just an idea or virtual representation of the user interface. So to give you an idea, this is just basically how your DOM should look like. This is just an ideal or a virtual representation of what the UI is supposed to look like. That is kept in memory and synced with the real DOM. So the real DOM is the browser DOM or the tree structure that we have discussed earlier in module 1. That structure is what it is then mapped onto. The real advantage of using virtual DOM is something that we'll see in a moment, but the real reason why we use a virtual DOM is because the actual DOM is quite expensive to work with. Whenever you make changes to it, there are going to be a lot of changes that you have to make here and there, and that leads to a lot of performance degradation. A good idea of getting over it is to use virtual DOM. In virtual DOMs, what we do is we create inline similar structure, and what we do is we use that structure in order to make sure that what we're doing is taking effect and then mapping those changes over to the real DOM. So a virtual DOM is used to encapsulate things, and it is encapsulated in the React DOM packages. So if you've taken a look at the module previously, what that taught us was that React was supposed to be, it's something that is supposed to be used with multiple platforms, ranging from the web to native mobile applications to virtual reality applications. So in order to abstract away all the DOM related functionalities from React.js, we use React DOM. And the virtual DOM is a concept that has been encapsulated in React DOM so that it can only be used on the web. Virtual DOM is not a concept that gets carried over to React Native or React VR, because these are different environments. They don't have the concept of DOM. So React uses virtual DOM to improve performance, as we've heard many times. But the real question is, how does it do it? Well, React uses a virtual DOM as in to improve the performance so that the real DOM is updated only when it's needed, and all the necessary updates and the transitions are made in the virtual DOM, which is in memory and it's really fast. This process of updating the real DOM from the virtual DOM is called reconciliation. It's a concept that basically means that once we have done making changes with the React DOM, we try and figure out what are the changes that need to be persisted to the actual DOM, what is the current state of the actual DOM, and how are we going to do those changes.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of React.js by answering this question. What is React.js? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
So for instance, if I have 3 nodes in my actual DOM and 3 nodes in my virtual DOM, and only one of those nodes in my virtual DOM change, we'll go and look through all the DOM nodes that are available, figure out what are the DOM nodes that have changed, and update those only, so that we do the minimum work required for DOM. That this is mainly because DOM is very expensive. The document object model, it has a lot of issues in itself, which is why we don't like to use simple plain JavaScript. Because if we do use it, then it's going to lead to a lot of problems in terms of performance. And the performance issues really degrade the user experience, which is why React is so popular, because it takes care of managing the performance behind the scenes. So we don't have to worry about how to manage the performance. React will take care of all of that. And the way it does it is using virtual DOM. So you don't have to actually deal with the virtual DOM yourself. React does it itself. But this is a concept that is used throughout the React community, and we have to understand what it actually means and how React does the actual performance optimizations that it needs to. And now that we have done that, let's see what else we have to learn. Now that we have taken a look at virtual DOM, next is we have to understand JSX. JSX is the syntax extension that allows us to use React.js much more declaratively and efficiently. So under the hood, React uses the create element method to create a new DOM node that need to be attached to the nodes. So React at the end of the day is creating DOM nodes, but for us to tell React that we want to create a DOM node of this type, we can use plain React, which will involve us writing React.createElement, and inside the function will pass in 3 parameters, and that is going to be really cumbersome. The main reason why React was not really that popular at the beginning was because it was really verbose. So as you can see that it's very difficult to use, especially when we have components nested into each other. So this can make our code really unreadable. So if you have React.createElement calls going from start to end of your code, it's going to make your code really unreadable. It might be fine for smaller applications, for smaller elements when you only have 3 or 4 DOM nodes that you need to add and manipulate. But it could be really difficult for the other parts of the application when you have like multiple applications or multiple DOM nodes interacting with each other, keeping the data in sync with the DOM nodes. It could be really problematic. So to solve this in React, we use a special syntax. That syntax is called JSX. So what JSX allows us to do is that it ultimately compiles to React.createElement calls, but it makes our code easier to read. So underneath the hood, once you've written your code in JSX, you just run your application, and JSX's compiler will take care of everything else. It will take your code, compile it to React.createElement calls, and it will be interpreted by the browser, which in turn will use the React library and build the DOM nodes, or so that you can build applications much more easily and much more effectively, and you don't have to worry about making the calls that need to be made in order to create DOM nodes. Now, React does not mandate the use of JSX, which is to say that React doesn't need you to use JSX. You can reuse plain React in order to build your applications, and if you choose to do so, that's fine. But do understand that once you use the JSX, it makes your code easier to read and understand, and it is thus far the recommended way of doing it, unless they come up with a new way. But so far, this is the recommended way, mainly because it makes your code more readable, more concise, more understandable. So because of these features that React JSX provides, we use JSX throughout our React code. Most of the developers currently using React will use JSX as their primary syntax. In case you wish to use some other syntax, you are more than welcome to, but JSX is by far the most popular way. If you don't want to use JSX, then you would have to use the plain React.createElement calls, which are going to make your code much more unreadable and really not that concise. Could be difficult to part through a large DOM structure. So that's all about JSX. Now let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at props. Props is an important concept in React.js. It's one of the 2 ways through which you can store data for a component. So props stands for properties. Props is the short form of properties, and they are arguments passed to a component by a parent component for it to use. So one of the differences between the other ways of using internal data and props is that props is not internal. This is data that is passed from a parent component. So if I have a component that is rendering other components, I can pass in some data for those components to render. And that's how the data should flow in a React app, from a parent application, from a parent component to a child component, and props allow us to do that. Props are read-only and should not be modified by a component on its own. So if you have a component that has some data being passed into it via props, you should not modify it. They can only be modified by the parent passing those props. So if you are a parent component that are rendering a few child components and you're passing some data, you have the ability to modify that data. But the component that is receiving that data as props cannot change the data. This is one of the concepts in React in which you cannot change the data that is being passed to you. The reason for that is because if all the components that are being passed the data, some components pass data downstream. So anywhere down the stream, if some component ends up changing some data, then it's very difficult to reason about, and it's very difficult to debug. So in order to overcome this, these are the few guidelines that we have to follow in order to make better decisions about the code that we write. And change in prompts from the parent component will lead the child components being updated and re-rendered to the DOM. So if you have some data in your parent component, since that is the only place where you can change it, and that is the only place where you're supposed to change it. When you do change it, it will lead to a re-render, which means updated data will be merged with the current representation in our DOM node, and the reconciliation process will happen, and anything that needs to be updated will be updated in the child components. and nothing in the child components could actually change the props, so that would not lead to a re-render. So this is why when you get something from props, make sure that you know how to change it, and the only way to change it, or the access to change these things, or the code that needs to change it, needs to exist in the parent component. If, for instance, you have some reason to make your data be changed by your child components, or you need some way to access the code that changes the props in your child component, then you can pass in functions that do the same. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. So that's how you're supposed to do it. Right, so now we're done with props. Let's take a look at what else we have. Now we come to state. State is the other way that we can change data in a component. So props were passed from parents to child component. State is the internal data. So if you have some component that needs to have data that's only localized to itself, and the parent component doesn't know about it, doesn't care about it, and doesn't have access to it, that's state. So let's take a look at it. State is similar to props, but it is private and fully controlled by the components. So if I have a component and it needs some internal data in order to display something, that data is something that needs to be stored as state. If it's something that the component that is the rendering my component needs to be able to pass in, for instance, the color of the border or something like that, then that is something that needs to be turned as props. But if it's something like a behavior when the person clicks on the button and I want it to be just one thing, then I use state. So this is where state and props come into play. State holds data that is internal to the component, that is required by the component, and the parent components need not know about it. The state is used by components to determine what is to display on the screen, and has been managed by the component itself, as other components do not have access to the state. As we have discussed earlier, that once we're building a component, we need to be able to understand that that component, if it has a state, that state is not visible to outside components. That's its state only. So that could be passed down to child components as props, but still, so you are the one who is able to manage it. You're the ones who are able to figure out how to manage the data and how to change the data. The other components don't have access to it. So that's why we use that. So what exactly is child components and parent components? We have all taken a look at that. That's just the hierarchy, and that's how we create components. So in React, a component state should not be changed directly. It should be done via a special setter method, because React keeps track of the state. So if you want to change the state, you don't just go and fiddle with the variables and mutate it, which is to change it. So if you have a state that's containing the name of the currently logged in user, if that needs to change, then you don't to just reassign the variable to the new name. What you do is you call a special setter method. Depending on what kind of component it is, usually the method is called set state. So inside set state, you pass in an object. That object contains the key and the value. Key is the variable you want to change. Variable is and the value is the value that you want to assign to it. In React, the state is kept as a JavaScript object. So that's how you can do that. In functional components, which we'll take a look at in a moment, we use hooks, and we'll also take a look at that in a moment. So that is a little different from the set state function, but the idea is the same. You have a variable and you have a setter function. The function's only job is to set the data and let React know that something has changed, re-render the thing that needs to be updated, or at least be aware that things have changed, and the next time you re-render, make sure that you change these things. So that's how state works. State are quite the opposite of props, in the sense that you don't have to get it passed from parent components. You derive the data yourself and you take care of the data itself. So those are state and props. Now let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at lifecycle methods. Lifecycle methods allow us to hook into important events in our React component lifecycle. Let's take a look at what that means and how you can use it to your advantage. React manages the lifecycle of the components. So tasks such as adding or removing the component from the DOM, all of that is taken care of by React. So you just need to declare the component, and when the component is mounted, when the component mounted basically means added to the DOM, when the component is removed from the DOM, all of that is taken care of by React. Now that presents some challenges to us, because there are tasks as web developers that we need to perform when the components are being added and when they're being removed from the HTML page. So some of these tasks may include fetching some data and displaying it to the user. So only after the component is displayed on the screen, then do we want to update the data onto it. If it's not on the screen and we're updating the data, we're wasting time. Also, with that, another issue is that event handling is something that we need to take care of. If we are on a page where a component is mounted and it has an event handler attached to it, once we move away from that component, when that component is removed from the screen, we need to disassociate those event handlers. The reason being that that could cause a memory leak. These are the kind of things that we need to be aware of when we're using React components. And this is why lifecycle methods are such important aspect. There are many other things that you can do with lifecycle methods, but these are some of the things. Let's take a look at a few lifecycle methods. So to allow developers to execute code during these life cycles, React provides them with lifecycle methods, which you can override. So these are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. There are many other lifecycle methods available, and sadly we can't cover all of them, but these are the most important ones. So the component did mount lifecycle method is something that you can override when you want to execute some code after a component is added to the DOM. So you want to, let's say you want to propagate an event that the component is available on the screen, and so that other components can manipulate it. It could also be that after the component is mounted, you want to make sure that it has a particular style. You can only do that once it's been mounted. Whether or not it's being displayed, that's a completely different thing. Now, this is ideal for when data is fetched and we want to add it to the DOM. So if we have a component such as an unordered list, and we have a lot of list items in our components, and we want to add them to our unordered list, that can only happen when the list is added. So to do that, what we do is create list items. We wait for the component mounted. When the component does mount, we write the code in component did mount, which will get executed. And that's the code that will add all the things into the components, and our code will work just fine. Then comes component did update. This is a lifecycle method that allows developers to execute code after a component gets updated. So these components may get updated due to props or state change. And if that's the case, if the props of your component change and you want to propagate those changes elsewhere depending on the props, then you can use this lifecycle method. You can also do this for state as well. If you want to pass some data down to child components as props, you can use the state components or use state, and that will work just fine as well. And then comes component will unmount. This is a lifecycle method that gets executed before the component is going to be removed from the DOM. So right before the component is going to be removed from the DOM, if a developer wants to execute some code that can be run at that point specifically, then we use component will unmount. This is ideal for removing event listeners from components to stop memory leak. So if you have an event listener attached to all the DOM nodes of your component, and that component is going to be removed, you want to make sure that all of those event listeners are being removed as well, so that your component don't leak things to memory. And if we have removed it, then the JavaScript garbage collector will execute, take everything away, and we can move on and with a clear of memory. So with that, we have come to the end of lifecycle method. Let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at components. Components are the building blocks of any React application. We use components to encapsulate our UI logic of a particular element of our web page or web browser's front end. And what we want is for those components to be reusable. But what are they? In React, a UI is built using individual independent pieces called components. These pieces are used to encapsulate logic, markup, and styles, and then they could be reused into other places. The user interface is built as a tree of components that are managed and converted into native DOM elements by React. So what React does is that it allows us to write components that can then be used by other components as well. And for React DOM takes care of changing those components from React.createElement calls to the native DOM elements that need to be displayed on the web page. And all of that is taken care of by React. So all we have to do is understand how to create components, how to make data flow through our components, and how we can use those components in order to work with our application's internal data representation. And all of that is then extremely useful. So components allow us to build single, reusable, and isolated piece of UI, which can be used to efficiently render the user interface. If you have components, then you can use those components, use simple components to build complicated user interfaces. Because if we have a form that needs to be displayed on the screen, it is built up of very small components such as the text field, a button to submit the data, a button to reset the data inside the form, and many other things. So that's where you can use components. Components are really useful in that regard. Now in React, there are two types of components. which are created: class components and function components. So these have their own distinct advantages and disadvantages. These have their own distinct reasons to be used and not to be used. Just take and understand what they are and how they compare against each other. Now let's take a look at class components. Class components is one of the way we can create components in React. So class components are created by creating classes that we have seen in the previous module, how to create classes in JavaScript using ES6 syntax. And those classes need to be extended using the React.component class. So there's a class named component in the React package, and we need to extend that class and override its render method, which we'll take a look at. The class name will be the same as the name of the component. So if you have created a class with the name of login component, that is going to be the name of the component that is going to be rendered on the screen. So a class component needs to override the render method using JSX to describe the markup of the component. So if you have a component that has a form and you want to display that form, you need to firstly you need to use JSX syntax, or you can use React.create element as well, but JSX is the preferred way. And inside the render method that you are overriding from the React.component class, we return the JSX. That return JSX will then be compiled to React.create element, which will then be converted into the real DOM by our React application. So we don't have to do a lot here. We just need to know how to write JSX and how to extend a class and create a component using that class. That's the entire gist of what we have to learn. Now, class components are still supported in React, but it is preferable to use functional components to React boilerplate code. The reason why is because, and we'll take a look at that, but in essence, it allows us to reduce boilerplate code, and React class component has a few problems, and we'll take a look at those in future. But right now, all we have to understand is that there are class components, there are function components. Class components are still supported, and there are reasons to use them, but mostly it's preferred to use functional components, and we'll take a look at that next. So now let's take a look at functional components. Functional components are the second way that you can build a component in React.js. So you can declare how a component is supposed to look and function. So let's take a look at that. In a functional component, we create functions instead of a class. So as you can see, functions are something that are taken to the extreme in the React ecosystem when we create a functional component. The reason why we use a function is going to be cleared out in a moment, but since we don't have to use classes, we don't need to use constructors, we don't need to use class properties and all of that. It's simply a function. It's going to be very easy for us to build. That function is supposed to return some JSX to describe the component markup. That JSX may be littered with some function calls here and there, which also can hook into the React ecosystem and allows us to describe what should happen. Now, functional components take props as parameters and have state to keep track of the data to be displayed. It's very similar to the class components, but in class components, we take props in the render function, whereas here the component function takes in the props. And we'll take a look at that. That simplifies our code greatly. We don't have to write a lot of this boilerplate code where we write the class, then the class name, then the extends keyword, then React.component, then create a constructor, and binding those functions, and a lot of different tasks need to go right in order for us to create a class component. And functional component is simply a function that can have state, that can have props. Functional components can have a lot of different moving parts put to them as well. So in React, functional components are given preferences as they are less verbose and more maintainable. Now, the reason why functional components are given that preference now and earlier class components were given these preferences because of a new addition to the React ecosystem called hooks. We will take a look at hooks in future, but right now you need to understand that this change in the mental model is because we have introduced a concept of hooks that allows functional components to have state in them and have lifecycle methods in them. Two of the concepts that we have discussed earlier. Before that, what functional components were limited to do was to just take in some props and return some JSX. They were not allowed to have any internal data of themselves, which was a bit difficult and a bit tricky to get around. So we had to rely on class components. But now, since class components are not the only way you can do it, it's much more easier for us to use function components. With that, we have come to the end of functional components. Let's take a look at what else we have.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides ReactJS online training mentored by industry experts. The course link is given in the description below. Now, let's continue with the session.
Alright guys, so now let's take a look at class versus functional components. We have two ways of building components. So let's take a closer look as to when to use or what are the criteria you need to consider in order to build class components or functional components. So the first thing is backwards compatibility. If you have a project in React that's using an older version of React and it's not been updated and there's a lot of code that you need to update, then using functional components right at the beginning is going to be really tricky. Since class components have been supported since the beginning and are still supported in React, functional components on the other hand were always supported in React, but they could not hold any state until React version 16.8. So if you want to use functional components in previous versions of React, you need to firstly make sure that functional components can be used the way you want them to use. If you want some state, then it's better that you don't. If it's a really simple component that only needs props and displays the data and then that's it, then you can use React quite easily with that. Now comes state and props. So in class components for state, we use setState function, which is something that we get by extending the component in our class. So we get a React.component is extended in our class, and now we get access to the setState function. And for the props, we use parameters passed to the render function. So all of that is useful and all of that is easy to use. But in function, the fundamental difference is that in functional components, we use the useState hook. So instead of us having to extend the class and then use this dot set state, all we have to do is use the useState function, which is also called the useState hook. And using the useState hook function, we can create state, which when changed will cause a re-render of the component. This is how you can change the component in React, by changing the state variables. Then comes lifecycle methods. Lifecycle methods are useful for class and function components both, but the way you implement them is different. So in class components, you have defined methods that you need to override, and that came with its own set of challenges. For instance, if you had a component that used the same code when the component is mounted and when the component is updated, in situations like this, you would have to use class component, you would have to duplicate some code, which was an issue. In functional components, though, you have other ways of doing this. We have the use effect hook, and the use effect hook allows us to just define the code, and then we can define the variables that the hook needs to watch. And if those variables change, then the effect needs to run again. So that's how we do class components and function components. We'll take a look at that in the demo as well. And then comes verbosity, which is one of the major drawbacks of class components. Class components are extremely verbose. There's a lot of boilerplate code that you need to get over in order to build anything useful. This is why developers prefer using functional components, but so many developers prefer using class components only when they are necessary. So if there are certain functionalities that we want to build that is only available in class components, then only we will use class components. Otherwise, we'd end up using functional components. And this is why we use functional components in React, because they are not very verbose. So functional components are really concise. Hence, they are the preferred way of building components in React applications instead of classes. Right. So now let's take a look at what else we have. Now we have come to prop types. Let's take a look at what prop types are. Prop types allow us to define the shape of the props that our components are expecting. So since props are something that the parents can pass, they can end up passing anything of any data type. Even if we are expecting an email to be of type string, they could pass in a boolean saying true. And we would have to take care of whether or not the props are being passed correctly. That could be a lot of issues. So in situations like this, prop types come to our rescue. Prop types allow us to define the shape of our props and the types and the whether or not a prop is required to be passed in or not. And with that, we'll come to understand, well, how are we going to use those prop types. So using prop types, we can define what is the data type of a particular prop, if it's required, if it's not required, and many other things that we can do. Using prop types, we can then understand how you can use we need to then define the shape of our props, different kinds of props. Props is data type. So if you're expecting a boolean, an integer, a number, or whatever, and then our React.js will take care of validating the props on its own. It'll throw a warning if the props are of incorrect shape and size and incorrect, and they're not following the standards that we have set, and that will cause some issue. So prop types are validated by React automatically. All we have to do is define the shape of the constraints. So React will throw an error or a warning depending on what the prop types library you're using is. React has extracted the prop types into a separate library. So if you want to use prop types in React, you have to import that script, and then it will work. And whether or not props are passed in correctly or not is what's going to determine the throwing of warnings. So we'll use prop types to figure out how to do that. If we're not using prop types, then we have to do the manual plumbing of figuring out what the data type of a particular prop is, whether it was passed or not, whether it's undefined. If it is undefined, then how we're going to use it, so on and so forth. So that's how we use prop types. So now let's take a look at what else we have to do. So now let's take a look at how we can create a React component. We'll take a look at how to create a React component without using JSX, so the plain JavaScript syntax. So let's take a look at that. Now let me just show you the setup that I have. I have an index.html file. It's empty. It doesn't contain any code relating to displaying anything on the screen. As you can see, there's nothing there. Let's just start writing some code. HTML React. Now I need main div tag with the ID of main, and I need these two scripts. So let me just explain what these scripts are. This is the React development version. This is the React DOM development version. If you're building for production, you need to change this to production as you can. But right now, since we're building for development and we want to see the errors and warning, we want the development version. Now I'll just write the code needed for React in order to show our component. So the component that we have is going to be called greeting. I'm going to use a function to create the component. Right. So for that, I'll have to firstly write function. We'll be using the simple JavaScript syntax in order to write the code. So we need to write greeting, and this is going to return a React component. So it's not taking any parameters. Return React dot create element React dot create element. Inside it, we need to pass three things. Firstly, the kind of element we want. We want an h1. Do we want any attributes to attach to it? No. And what are its children? So we just want a text node which says hello world. Right? Save it. It's done. Now we need to render it to the DOM. So we need to use React DOM dot render render. We use the greeting function, which in turn returns the React component we want, and we want to render it inside the element with the ID of app. That is done. I've saved everything. Refresh it, and if I open it up inside the console, as you can see that target container is not a DOM element. That's because .app it's main, and now it's done. As you can see that it's also being shown in our console that download the React dev tools for better experience. Right now we're not using the create React app version, which comes in with a local server. We're just importing it in a file and using it. From there on, we can expand, and if we're building applications that are much more complicated, then we can set up create React applications. And we'll take a look at that in future lessons. The reason why we're not doing it is because that's going to be a little complicated and it takes time to set up any application that way. So that's why we're not doing it that way. But if you are doing it that way, then you can take a look at React Dev tools as well. So we have done this. If I go to my code, this is what it looks like. We have a React development version. We have the React DOM development version. Using React.create element, we create a h1 tag. As you can see inside the div, nothing's there right now. But if I open up my console, go to elements, and you can do it in your browser as well. It's dynamically added needed. So that's how you can create an element in React. Alright, now let's see what else we have. Alright guys, so now let's take a look at how we can create a React component using JSX. So earlier we had taken a look at how to create a React component without JSX. Now let's see how easier the process is with JSX. So again, I have an index.html page, no code to display anything on the page yet. All I have is the previous setup. Now I need to just add these three scripts. So earlier you remember I had two scripts, right now I have three. First is the React development version. Second is the React DOM development version. And third is the Babel compiler. This is what will compile our JSX code into our JavaScript code. Now for that, we need to write the script. Now, one thing you have to do when you're displaying using JSX is you have to describe the type of script. Text/Babel. This instructs the browser that whatever I'm about to write in here is not just plain JavaScript. It's something that needs to be compiled using Babel, and Babel will take care of the rest of it. Table is the compiler that will compile it from JSX to React.createElement. Now all I have to do is create a component. So create a functional component because it's going to be easier. I don't need any state right now. And I will do the same thing. As you can see, it looks like I'm writing HTML, but I'm not. And now all I have to do React DOM.render, and here I have to render it as greeting. As you can see, again, this is the name of my component, greeting, and I have to render it as if it's an HTML page or an HTML component. I can, for instance, instead of doing it this way, I could have just done it this way. This is how you open and close a tag in HTML, same as you can do here. But since I only want to render this component and there are no child components, I can do a self-closing tag. So it opens and closes in one tag only. I don't need to create an opening tag and then a closing tag. Now I need to pass in document.getElement by ID, and it's going to be main. Save it, refresh it. It'll take some time because it's downloading 3 giant files. Take a look at if we have gotten any errors. We have not, and we have a hello world element. As you can see, here it is, hello world. And if I take a look at the code, it's just 3 lines of code. Essentially, it's just 3 lines. Not even 3 lines. It's just 3 lines. 3 to 4 lines of code, and it's not really difficult to understand as well what we're doing. We have a greeting component that needs to return this markup. Instead of us having to specify the h1 tag, its attributes and children's in 3 specific stages, all we can do here is just write it as HTML. It'll get compiled to JSX. JSX will compile it to pure JavaScript. And then all we have to do is say, okay, when you compile this, whatever return you get, whatever response you get returned, display that within this element, which is this one. That's how we do that. Now that we are clear on how to use JSX with React, let's just recap what we have learned. Need a basic HTML page, need somewhere to display our code. If I didn't have div main, I could have just written get element by tag name, and here I can just type in body 0, and that will work just fine. 0 would mean, because since we're getting a tag name and we could enter a tag says p, and p can have many elements on the page such as a paragraph, so we can do it that way. But that's not very useful, so we have this. This is the preferred way, by the way, to have a single div element that contains your entire application. And now we just, after creating this, we import all the required libraries: React DOM, Babel. We describe to our script tag. This is an important bit. You should not forget this. If I remove this and then I run this, my browser will try and interpret it as plain JavaScript and will run into an error. If I refresh this and I see nothing on the screen yet, and it just runs and runs, and I get an error. It doesn't understand why do I have a less than symbol in my browser. If I change it and then if I refresh it, it works just right. So you have to unfortunately do it this way here. Then we just describe a function that will return this. You can also describe it as a class, which we'll take a look at in a moment, and then we can display it. Now that we have come to an end to the JSX portion of our hands-on, let's take a look at what else we have. Now let's take a look at how we can pass props to our component. We'll create a component and then we'll modify its behavior by passing in some props. So for that, all we have to do is follow along with the previous hands-on. I'll just show you. So I have the same index.html page. It has no code to display anything on the page yet. Everything is just boilerplate HTML, and we have a div tag with the ID of main. We have the React development version. We have the React DOMs development version. We have the Babel compiler, and we have a script tag that is going to contain some JSX code. All I have to do now is create a component that we had created earlier, and it's going to have the same code, but I'll show you what I have done differently this time. So, and the semicolon is not required in JavaScript, but many developers like to write it. So do I. So inside the React DOM, we now document.getElement by ID. This should all be familiar since we had done it earlier. Not add, it's supposed to be main. So after I've saved it, I'll refresh it. It'll take some time because it's downloading these files, and now we have it. But let's say that I want to, when I'm rendering it, I want to change things. The way I can do this is by changing it here. So if I want to say hello John, I can do hello John, and if I want to say hello Jane, I can do it this way. But that's really cumbersome. I want this to be dynamic. I want this to be able to be changed by the person who's rendering it. So the way I can do it here is by accepting some props. Props. I can call it anything I want, but I like to call it props here. And now if I want to dynamically display anything inside my JSX code, I have to wrap it inside a curly brace like this. As you can see, the syntax has changed, props dot, and I will call it name. I'll save it. So just to recap, all we have done is we have passed in some props. I have hello, and I want to display anything that has the value of the name contains inside our props object. So how do we pass in the value? Basically, when we're rendering the component, all we have to do is pass in name to be equal to, and it's supposed to be a string. So let's say I call it John. Save it, and if I reload.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of React.js by answering this question. What is React.js? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
Just hang on for a moment. It's rendering everything. Just take a look at all of it. Since it's downloading the file, and yeah, now it's done. So we have hello John. But you might be wondering, why do you have to use it? I mean, you could have just written hello John and save it, go back, refresh it, and the answer is the same thing, right? What's the reason for using a prop? So the reason why is, let me just show you, because this makes our component dynamic. Now our component is not just limited to John. Let's say that I want to have 3 components, and I'm just going to create them here. Function demo, and this is going to return a div with greeting. And whenever we're returning a component, we can't return 3 components as it is. We have a demo component that's returning our JSX code. It's wrapped inside a div, so this should work. Okay, we've run into an error. Oh, that is because we have to pass in props.name. And now, as you can see, we have hello John, hello Jane, hello Johnson. Now, in case you want to use hello John, hello Jane, hello Johnson, and you can even create more of these components by themselves, right, just as an HTML markup. This is the power of props. So I'll just remove it and bring it back to the normal state with greeting name John. And since it's working fine, all I have to do now is just reload it again and see if it's working, and it is. So with that, we've come to the end of props, understanding what props are and how to use them. As you can see, we did not change them anywhere in our code because that's not allowed. Now let's take a look at what else we have to do. Now we'll take a look at using state in a React application in React components. State is local to a component, so we don't need to pass it to a particular component. And we'll take a look at how that works. All right, so let's take a look at that. Again, we have our simple apps setup. We have an index.html file, displays nothing on the screen. The code is quite simple as we had earlier. And now all I have to do is create some state, right? And since we're using a functional component, I can just, don't worry about the syntax right now. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Just understand that this is how you define state, and from here we have to just return an h1 tag, name being printed, and nothing more. And all I have to do now is render it to screen. So greeting, we don't have to pass in the name. Right, so everything's done. If I open it up and if I refresh it again, as you can see, it's showing John, which was the name. And if you want to make it completely compliant to what we had earlier, hello, save it, refresh it, and then this. Now, where does state matter here? Because we were clearly able to do it using props. Well, sometimes what happens is we get some data not from we don't get the data from external services or external components. We want to get it from our web server. For instance, if it's a user-based application and we're logging in a user, we want to display the username. So for one instance, let me just show you. I'll just simulate a network call instead of getting a network call. Function get user info. This will return a promise that resolves to username being John and age being 28. Right. So now what I can do is at the beginning it's supposed to show nothing, but when I get user info, this will return a promise, and I can use the then function to get the user. And now all I have to do is set name to user dot name. As you can see, we're not using age right now, so we don't have to do that, but we could very easily do it. Now if I refresh it again, as you can see, it says hello John. Now, but this is something that we have gotten from an external component. So if this is something that only my component needs and other components don't, then this my component can get it from the user's internet and make a request to a web server, get the data, pass the response, and then paste it onto the user screen using this syntax. So this is how we do this. Now that we have covered state as well, let's see what else we have. Now let's take a look at how to create a class component. So again, we have our same setup. We have an index.html page. It's not displaying anything. And we have our code. We have a div tag with the ID of main, React, React DOM, and Baby. So we're going to create a class component. Now for that, let's take a look at the anatomy of how do you create a class component. You start with the class keyword, then the name of the component. Earlier, we would have, for the ES6 class syntax, we would have to use function, greeting, and do a lot of complicated tasks. So something as simple as creating a class, but now you can do it this way. This will extend the React component class, and as you can see, that now we have to type in the constructor function because we want some initial state, and it takes in some props. We have to call the super function, pass in the props. This is why the class components are not so preferred over functional components, which we'll take a look at that in a moment. But the reason why is because there's a lot of boilerplate code you have to write. We have written 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code for not any reason, because these are not the kind of things that you would have to write. They don't have anything pertaining to our business logic. Now let's set up a state. This is something that we would have to do. And I'll write a greeting to be hello. This is something that's going to be internal. I can create a render function. That render function is going to return, and again, because it's a class, I have to use this keyword greeting. Here I'll just get the name from props. That's it. So now if I want to see something happen, I would have to render it to the page. React DOM.render greeting. I have to pass in the name to be John document dot get element by ID. We'll save this, refresh it, and it displays everything. But as you can see, that just for a simple component like this that takes one bit of content from state, other bit from prop, and displays it on the screen, we have to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines of code. So by creating one component, it was 9 lines of code. That doesn't have in much. It needs something from the state, something from the props, and needs to be displayed here. That's basically all that needs to be done. So that was an issue. And so this is one of the issues with class components. Now let's take a look at what else we have. Alright guys, so now we'll take a look at how to create function components. Earlier we taken a look at class components and we saw that although it was relatively easier to do creating class components, but there are a lot of verbosity involved. We had to write a lot of boilerplate code. Let's take a look at how function components can solve that. So again, the same setup. We have an index.html file, displays nothing. Here's the code. Now we'll create the same component, but here we'll be using function. So as we know, it was called greeting. It will accept some props. When we need a greeting and we need a function to set greeting, that needs to be something that we need to use using React. Use state inside it. Default value is going to be hello, and now all I have to do is return an h1 tag that prints out greeting as well as the name from the props. Yeah. So finally, now all we have to do is just react dom dot render, pass in greeting, pass in name, pass in John as the name, and document dot get element by ID. The element is going to be me. So now as we have this, let's see if this actually works. So we refresh it, and as you can see, everything works correctly. Now, the thing to notice is that we didn't have to write a lot of code. Even from a purely aesthetic point of view, we only had to write 3 to 4 lines of code in order to create a component. There we had 9 lines of code, and to be quite honest, each line of code was really long. We had to write how to get state. For accessing the greeting, we had to write this state.greeting. For accessing name, we had to write this props.name. And for small components, it's fine. But for larger components, these things really do matter because you'll be writing thousands of components. So you'll have to write thousands of 10,000s of more lines of code. And that's really the kind of code that you're writing is something of a problem, because if you're writing more code, that means more code that you need to maintain, more code that you need to manage, and more code that you need to keep in your mind in order to understand what's going on. So this is why functional components are more preferred. So let's take a look at what else we have. Okay guys, now we'll take a look at prop types. Prop types is an external library, so we'll firstly have to import it, and then we'll have to make it use with React.js. Let's see what the implications of using prop types are and how to use them. So again, the same code. This time I'd also like to open up my console. As you can see, nothing's being displayed right now. We are using the Babel transformer in development. Everything's fine. So let's just take a look at that. Here's our code. Firstly, I'll have to import the prop types library. This is what the current version is. You can import any other version. And from here on, I have to create components. So I'll create a greeting component that will just return hello in the props name. So function greeting takes in props, returns an h1 tag, which is hello and name. So that's done. We render it to the DOM using React DOM. To document.get element per ID. The ID that I want is in main. The name is going to be John. I refresh this. Hello John is being displayed, but there's an issue with this. If I'm someone who has exported this into a library and another person wishes to use it, what they can do instead of John, they can pass in 5 as a number, and we want it to be a string. It's going to display it nonetheless, that's fine, but still it's a problem. Also, if I type in true, and then I refresh it, nothing's going to be displayed because true and false are not something that is displayed in JSX. So the user has the liberty of passing in something that's completely useless for us. So in order to prevent that, or at least have the developers or people who use this component some idea whether or not they're doing things correctly or not, we can prop types. It's equals to, and this is going to be an object that has the name of the prop, which is the name, and it is going to tell us that inside it we want string and it is required. Now if I save it, go back, refresh it. As you can see, we're getting a warning. Failed prop type. Invalid prop name is of type boolean supplied to greeting expected string. Another thing that's important is that if the user doesn't pass in a prop, which they are at the liberty of doing, we will again raise an error. And it will say failed prop type. The prop name is marked as required in greeting, but its value is undefined. So as you can see, we have ways of now a lot more control over how our props are being passed into our components. There are other ways as well, such as Flow and TypeScript, but they are a bit advanced. And for smaller applications, prop types are a great way. They check our props at runtime and they make us understand how we can use our props and how we can use props in other libraries. If we don't find it, then we'll have a warning issued in our console. So with that in mind, let's see what else we did. Alright guys, now let's take a look at problems with class components. There are several issues with class components, and that's what led to developers using function components with hooks. Hooks were there to provide function components the same capabilities that class components have. So with that, we will take a look at the problems that class components have. So class components have several issues with them, and we'll discuss them one by one. First one is constructor. So when using class components that uses state, we have to create a constructor that just isn't optional for us anymore. We have to have a constructor function, and in that constructor function there's another bit of functionality that we need to add. That is, we have to call the super method and pass in the props that are passed into the constructor. The issue with all of this is that although this is something that we would have to do on every classes, this is something that takes up a lot of work. We don't want to do all of these things specifically, mainly because when we're using constructor functions, when we're using class components, we have to write this lot of boilerplate code, which we don't intend to write at all. And this leads to really clunky and messy code and a lot of and there needs to be a lot of boilerplate code for us to write. Then comes binding. So if you've ever worked with JavaScript's event system, the problem with event handling in classes is that when you have a class and you create an event handler function inside a class, the value of this keyword inside the class changes. And we'll take a look at that in the demo, but the main problem with that is that if to solve this, we would have to always, after creating a function that's going to be used inside an event, needs to be bound to the current class, and we need to in the constructor write this dot method name equals to this dot method name dot bind, and in the brackets we have to type in this. That's really annoying and that's really cumbersome. We don't want to do that because that takes a lot of time, that takes a lot of effort, and that's not something that's necessary for us. Then comes sharing non-visual logic. So sharing non-visual logic is one of the major reasons why we like to use React, but the problem is that when we have non-visual logic, we would have to use a lot of complicated patterns like higher order components or render props. Don't worry if you don't know about them, it's just a little difficult to get started with it. It's going to be really difficult to understand what this means. So because of this, we have a lot of mental overhead in order to use class components. And finally, there's duplicated lifecycle logic. So in lifecycle methods, if we want to use the same code in different lifecycle methods, what we would have to do is we would have to copy and paste the code. Mainly because this is how classes function. You could extract it to a function, but still that function needs to be copied to multiple places, and that leads to a lot of problems as well. So with that, these are the kind of problems that we reach in class components. Specifically in the lifecycle methods, we would have to duplicate the code between different lifecycle methods, and that's one of the major reasons why React is not in React community. Lifecycle methods and all of this is used using hooks, because functions, these problems are not there. Alright, so now let's take a look at what else we have.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides ReactJS online training mentored by industry experts. The course link is given in the description below. Now, let's continue with the session.
So what are React hooks? Well, React hooks are used to create functional components with the same capabilities as class components. As we have discussed, class components have several disadvantages associated with them. So we want to create functional components that can counteract those. Functions are quite simple, quite straightforward, and they have quickly become the preferred way that React developers like to build their components. So let's take a look at some basic React hooks. We have use state, use effect, and use context. Let's take a look at them one by one. So as you can see that these are the three React hooks that we'll be taking a look at. But there are many other React hooks that we can take a look at as well. There are many that have been already created and many that are being added in the libraries that are already existing. So you can take a look at those at your own time. But these are the most common ones, and others are built on top of these. First one is use state. So as the name suggests, because in the class components we would have to create a state variable and use the set state function to update the state. In this case, we can use the use state function, and this will add some local state to our functional components. How to use this, I'll show you in the demo. Then comes use effect. The use effect hook is used to define code which is run either a component's loads or when some state changes. So if you have some component in which some state changes and you want some code to run whenever that happens and the component re-renders, then you can use the use effect hook. It's very much like the class components lifecycle method. However, it has some added benefits, and we'll take a look at this. So then comes use context. Context is a way to share some data or some state among multiple child components without passing them through every child component. Now, without using the use context hook in class components, you would have to do a lot of complicated patterns like the render prop pattern. But in our case, we don't have to do that because use context allows us to just extract data out of a context quite easily. So now let's take a look at a demo. Now in the demo, we'll take a look at a few implementation of how we can create hooks. Now you can create this demo quite easily. I will be using Code Sandbox. I'll just click on create a free sandbox. It will open up a web page and it will show me all the templates that are available. It's free, so you don't really have to even create an account and log in and sign up. It's quite easy to use. It's loading, and when it loads, it will show me a few templates. Templates will tell us what kind of a sandbox I want to create. I want to create one for React, but if you want to use Angular, Vue, Vanilla.js, Vue 3, static HTML page, React, TypeScript, and there are other components as well. But I want to use React. So I will click on this and make sure you are choosing the template by Code Sandbox, because that's the official template, or you can create your own if you wish to, in which you add your own libraries and all. So this will create an anonymous sandbox because I am not logged in, I have not created any account. You don't have to either. In case you wish to do this in your own PC, you can do that as well. I just want to show you a working environment in which can be set up in seconds. So this is what it looks like. This is the starting code. This is what we can see. Let's wait for a moment because it's initializing the JavaScript language features. As you can see, it's written here. So this is what we have. So right now we have everything we want. Let me just remove a few things. App component, not the app component, but the, yeah, everything's done. Now I will just remove this, and this is what a class component look like. Had it been a functional component, I would have to export default. Instead of being a function component, I would have to use class. Instead of being app, it would have been this extends react.component. So this is done. Now this has to be a function named render, and what it does is that it returns
some JSX code. If you've been using React for a little bit of a time, you know that this is how React works. And now, yeah, so nothing is being shown here. If I were to add a p tag, which is a paragraph tag, and this is, by the way, not HTML but JSX, it will be converted into JavaScript and then run into the browser. Type in hello, save it. And one other thing that you have to do sometimes is call a constructor function. And to do that, constructor and call the super function. And you can also pass in some props, and you can pass in some props here as well in case you wish to, or if you don't wish to, you don't have to do that as well. So that's how our class components work. Let's take a look at whether or not it's working. Export default class app, and we import it here. Yeah, so that's an issue. Classes may not have a field named constructor, so that is a problem that we have to solve, and that's the constructor function by default. If you don't want to use this, then you can simply just use the function component which we have created earlier. Now let's take a look at how hooks allow us to solve this. And if we just, yeah, so this is what it looks like. We are exporting a default function named app, and you can either choose to not rename it as well, but you can name it if you wish to. And this is what it looks like. Now, if I want to add some state to it, I have to use the use state hook. It's quite simple. I want to add some value to it. So let's say a number and set number. Now I have to use React.useState. It's a function. I have to pass in some default value. By default, it's going to be 0, and now I can use it. Let's just put it in an h1. And in React, if you want to output some data, you do it this way. And we have it here. Now, how do you update the data, or how do you update the state? The way you would do that in normal JavaScript or in normal React is by using the use set state function that was on the class. To call this, you would have to use the this dot set state function. That would be really difficult. So in order to overcome this, in functions you don't have to use this keyword. I'll just create a button, and that button is supposed to add something. So this will have an add button, this will have a decrement button, and now what we want to do is want to add an event handler. So when this button is clicked, what I want to do is I want to call the set number function, and this is going to take in the current number and return a number that is current number plus 1. So if I click here, as you can see, it is incrementing 1 for me. But if I want to change it a little bit, I can do that as well. Instead of incrementing, I can now decrement it. As you can see, now I can change it. So instead of using class components, I can just do it this way, and that works quite easily for me. So that's the set state. Now you can also use the use effect function. We'll take a look at that now. So this is how you can create state. Let me just remove all of this. Now if I want to use a state or use effect, React.use effect. This is how you do it. Let me just create some state as well, so I can tell you how you can use seconds, and set seconds is equals to React.use state. Pass in 0 as the default value, and what I want to do is, as the time progresses, I want to just show the amount of seconds that have passed. Quite easy, but in React it can be a little difficult. So it takes in this. Now I want to use a function that is the default function called set timeout. So firstly, timer ID, set timeout, and set interval. There are two functions that can do this. Let's take a look at set interval first. And it has two things that it takes in. the timer handler and the timeout. So firstly, I'll just take the timer handler. What it's supposed to do is that when it runs, it's supposed to call the set seconds function and increment the seconds by 1. And it's supposed to do this every 1000 seconds. And that's about it. So when we call the set interval function, it takes in a function and it takes in a timeout, and seem to have run into set is not defined. Oh yeah, let me just type it again. I think there has been some issue with the IDE, but it's not to worry about it. And if we run it now, let's see what happens. Basically what we have done so far is we have created a function that is supposed to run it again and again and again on each second, and as the second elapses, it's supposed to increment the second, and then it's supposed to make the changes. So let's see if it works. To do that, we firstly have to wait for a few seconds, and then okay, so it is being shown here. I'm not seeing anything right now because I'm not creating anything. And now all I have to do is show the second. That's the first thing. And the second thing I have to do is I have to return a function that will call another function called clear interval and will remove the timer ID. So that is done. Let's take a look at any error that we might have. It says that there is unterminated JSX content. I think it's talking about earlier content. So let us just rerun this. Sometimes the code sandbox servers don't work as well. So it will just reload it in a moment. And because we didn't have to do anything, it works just fine. So as you can see, it is working now. 7, 8, 9. So all of this is working. Now let's just explain what happened. So we created an interval. I'll just remove this one. So we created an interval. The reason why we use the use effect hook is because we want to run it after the component is being displayed on the screen. So with that, we create a set interval hook or a set interval function, which is available in JavaScript by default. Then what we do is for each 1000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, we increment seconds by 1. So we have 1 more second each time. After doing that, we return another function named clear interval. What this does is that it allows React to know that when this component is being removed from the screen, I want to clear the interval, which basically means I want to remove this from the memory, this function handler. And that avoids something called a memory leak. Whenever you are using React hooks, you can pass it this and it will work just fine. Another thing you can do is pass in an empty parameter like this. This basically means that only run this when the component loads for the first time. Then when subsequently the component loads, when the state changes, don't run it again. So if you had some data that you want this effect to be dependent upon, which is if this effect should run when some data changes, you can put it here. And React will take care of keeping that in sync for you. So that's how you can use the use effect hook as well. There are several other hooks available such as use context, use memo, and many others.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of React.js by answering this question. What is React.js? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
Now let's take a look at what is Bootstrap. If you've been doing web development for any amount of time, Bootstrap is definitely one of the things that you've come across. So let's take a look at what that is. So Bootstrap is a styling library that allows developers to style their user interface components without writing too much CSS. In case you are a developer or you wish to be a software engineer that writes front-end code, then Bootstrap is a useful tool, especially in the prototyping stage. When you're building a user interface for a specific application and you want it to look a little more than just bland HTML, what Bootstrap does is that it allows you to use its already existing styles, and you can just show it to the developers and they can take a look at the user interface, and you can just use those user interfaces for yourself. Now, these user interface components can be used in React, Angular, plain HTML. There's no need for you to use them just in React. But the point here is that it allows you to build UI components that look good quite quickly. Instead of you having to hand roll the CSS yourself, you can just use Bootstrap stuff. Let's take a look at some of the advantages that Bootstrap provides. So there are several advantages. The first one being that it's cross-browser. Bootstrap is cross-browser, which basically means that since styling is one of the most important aspects of an front-end application, and the major hiccup that comes when we're styling is that we have to take care of several browsers, browser versions, and which one of those versions support the features that we are trying to use in our code. For instance, Internet Explorer might not support box shadows while Chrome might. So these differences need to be accounted for when you're building your own user interface. And when you're using a library, you want it to be performant on at least the latest versions of all these browsers. And Bootstrap delivers on that promise. It has a really good support for all the browsers. It allows us to make sure that even if we implement our user interface using Bootstrap, majority of it will be displayed on the screen, and none of it will look inconsistent from one browser to the other. If you're using if you're using Internet Explorer, we're using Safari, we're using Chrome, everything will look just the same. Then comes lightweight. So when we're including a new library or new framework in our application, we're introducing some size or some sizable amount of code to be sent over the wire on an HTTP connection. If we are trying to serve our application in regions where the internet connection is slow, then this could be a problem. Although Bootstrap takes care of this problem for us by being lightweight. Bootstrap doesn't take a lot of time, it doesn't take a lot of memory as well. It's only a few kilobytes that needs to be transferred over the internet, especially if it's gzipped, then you can just use it easily. Bootstrap also allows us to customize our own version of Bootstrap so that we only take in the components we need, and we can take a look at that in a moment. But that's really an important feature, especially when we're trying to learn new technologies. Then comes responsiveness. So responsiveness basically means that styles are responsive, which basically means that if you were to shrink your browser size, that things are fluid and they adapt to the currently available size instead of just being cut off with an ugly scroll bar showing up. So React and Bootstrap does that for us automatically. It is responsive by default, and we can customize the responsiveness by providing classes of Bootstrap classes into our HTML code. And we'll take a look at that as well. And then finally, documentation. Documentation is an important aspect of a web application. We want to use documentation for developers to get started with it, or you can learn more about the technology. So in case new versions come along and you want to explore the new features that have been introduced, as a developer, all you would have to do is to open up the documentation and look at how things are structured, how you can use the new code to build your own features. So finally, we have come to the hands-on aspect of presentation. So let's take a look at that. Before we go to the hands-on, this is the Bootstrap documentation site. You can go to getbootstrap.com. This is the site on which you can find anything and everything that you want to find out about Bootstrap. So in case you wish to learn more about Bootstrap and new technologies that are relating to Bootstrap, what you can do is you can just go to the homepage, go to documentation, and you can go down and you can see all the technologies or everything. And if you want to learn about a specific concept such as layout, grid layouts, and utilities for layouts, if you want to take a look at other components, you can take a look at the code, images. If you want to learn how to build a card, carousel, or forms, you can just click on one of these. It will open up. Another thing that's great about Bootstrap is that it provides these things called scroll spice. So if you want to scroll to auto sizing, just click on this and it will take you to that piece of code and it will explain how this is working. If you want to take a look at other forms such as form control, you can take a look at it here. It really doesn't matter, it will take care of it entirely for you. Also, you can take a look at input groups, you can take a look at jumbotrons. There are a lot of components that forms provide us with. So in case we want to get started with it, first things first, we have to get some link to Bootstrap. And again, for that, you just have to click on get started. The first link here is the only link we need. It's the bootstrap.min.css. You can download it and install it on your own system, but we don't have to do that because we just want to use it once. Also, if you want to use it with React.js, you can use this. It's called Code Sandbox. Click on the Create Sandbox feature or button. In case you're trying to follow along, just use Code Sandbox because you don't have to install anything there. And just click on React. It'll open up in a few moments and it'll show us the output. And this is what it looks like. This is the default code. You can change it whenever you wish to. So that's the default code for Code Sandbox. And there's another project called React Bootstrap. When you click on Get Started, this basically is a library that has Bootstrap integrated with React component. So basically, you can just import a component and use it. So for instance, if I wanted to create a jumbotron, instead of me having to write all the HTML code, all I could do is import jumbotron and just type jumbotron in my code and it will work. So if you are willing to not learn Bootstrap from its scratch and you know Bootstrap and you just want a library that does it entirely for you, you can use React Bootstrap. So that's one way to get started. But what if you want to build everything in React.js and Bootstrap from scratch? Well, there are ways of doing that, and we'll just take a look at those right now. But for that, firstly, you would have to have npm installed. Npm stands for Node Package Manager, and you also need to have after Node.js, you need to have React.js installed on your system, which is Create React App. Let me just show you how you can do that. Make sure that you have React.js installed or Bootstrap in Node.js installed by typing node -- version, and it gives you a version that's at least this one. Then it'll be fine. Now let's take a look at how you can create a React application. Do that. Just type npx create React app, and here you can type the name of your application. If I want to create an application that says React Bootstrap, then I can just call React-Bootstrap and press enter. Now I already have it done. In fact, I'm in the same folder. So I'd just like to show you that. Once I'm done, this is the folder structure. It comes with a lot of files in the source folder. I have removed all of those and just kept the app and index file. Now if I run this, npm run is the command that will run our React application. Okay, so it's saying npm start should be the one. I can just type this and this will work as well. If you want to run tests, you can run npm run test and it will work that way as well. So we are incrementing and this is what it's showing right now. Our code is running. This is the user and this is the command line interface that is being shown. We have a local network server that is localhost 3000. And now what we have to do is I have opened up the code in my browser and my code editor as well. So now if I want to make any changes, let's say I make a change by typing in h1 tag. In the h1 tag, I say hello, I save it, go back, and this will be reloaded automatically. I didn't have to reload it at all. So as you can see that this makes our development quite easy. So now let's start by creating a form using Bootstrap and React. All I will do is I'll create a folder. I'll call it components, press enter. Then I'll create a new file. I'll call it form.js. And you can call it form.jsx. It really doesn't matter. But I like to call it form.js or JSX. So
Now we need to create a component. Before that, I'll just like to use it here. And to do that, all I have to do is use the form component by typing in form. And now I need to import it. And for importing it, all I have to do is type the import form from, and I have to type the word form correctly. And I'm using components / form, and we're done. So now I have to return a JSX code. Firstly, in the form, I have to import React. Now that that is done, all I have to do is export a by default a function. I can give it a name, but I don't really have to do that. And now all I have to do is I have to return some JSX code. In case this doesn't make much sense to you, stick with us till the end and we'll show you how you can learn these things. But by default, what we're trying to do is we have created a JSX code, and now we're trying to create a form. Creating a form is quite easy. We just use the basic HTML commands. And now I'll create a div tag. This is where our Bootstrap code comes into play. So Bootstrap basically works with classes. If you take a look at the documentation, they will have code that has the word class in them. But if we take a look at React, it allows us to use the keyword class name instead of class. This is because we are using, even if it looks like we're writing HTML code, we are writing JavaScript code. And in JavaScript, class is a keyword that actually means something. So to avoid the confusion, we have a prop named class name, which when converted to HTML will be converted to class. So if you want to apply a class, here we have to apply a class known form group, group. So this makes Bootstrap available to our user interfaces and tells us how the user interface should look like. By default, it's not going to look anything like a Bootstrap form because we have not included Bootstrap in our project yet. But I'd like to show you how to do that in a moment. Firstly, I have created the form group. Now I need to create a label and an input. The label is there for, and we use the HTML4 in order to make it accessible. So it's going to be for an email field. I'm basically creating an HTML login form. And now email address. So I want the user to enter their email address here, and this will be inputted in an input of type email and the ID of email, because this is what the for tag is going to look at. Then we want to use a class of form control as well, and class name is going to be the one that we are using, form control. And if you want to add more attributes, you can, but here we don't really have to. And finally, we can add another text that tells us something more about our form, but we don't have to. So if I save this, if I go back to my code, this is what it looks like. Now, this does not look very pretty, neither does it look anything like what we have seen in Bootstrap. The reason why is because we have not added Bootstrap in our code yet. So all we can do here is just copy this code, which tells us how to use it. Copy and paste the style sheet link into the head of our code before all of your CSS loads. So when you're using Bootstrap, you go to the public folder, index.html, paste it here, right before title, save it. Now if I go back, now as you can see, this looks much nicer. However, it looks very contrived. And we'll just take a look at how to solve that in a moment. But before, let's just build our component. So the first form is done. Second, I'm just going to steal it from here. Here I want a password. Password type is going to be password. If I save this, what you will see is it's the exact same thing. Now comes the interesting bit. Now after I've done that, I can also create a checkbox, a kind of checkbox that you would see when you are working on a form that tells you that allow it to remember you for a long time. So here I have to again use a class name. I'll call it form group, and it also needs another HTML tag, form group form check, and that's done. So that's how our form is supposed to look like. We have a form group, we have a form check, and now we need an input, and we can also have a label. First, let's create an input. The input will be there so that the user can tell us what they would like to be the value of this input. So checkbox is there. Then we have class name. Class name is equal to, and it's going to be equal to form check input. And these are all the things that you can take a look at the documentation for in order to get a greater idea of what it actually is. Also, you can create an ID for checkbox because we are going to put this in our label. Now the label is going to be for checkbox, and what I want the label to say is remember me, and also you can add a class here so that Bootstrap can style it, and the class is supposed to be form check label. This is done as well, and now finally we need to have a button. Now the button doesn't need any div to wrap it. All we need is a button that can say a lot of things, but all we want is it for it to be of type submit, and we can call it login, and it needs to have a class. Now the class is going to be, for us, it's going to be btn primary. The primary is what's going to define its color, and now all we have to do is save this. If I go back, this is what our code looks like. This looks like a typical input button, and as you can see, when I click on the labels, my inputs get to be active. I think the password one, I made it incorrect. Let me just see. If I go to password, firstly I have misspelled it. Now it should work. So if I click on the password label, it activates my input. But as you can see, it's very stretched out. Again, Bootstrap provides us with styling that allows us to deal with this. Go to my div outside my form component, and I have to add a class name. This will be called container. When I put container here, as you can see, everything squishes in between. Now this does not mean that I have to only use Bootstrap styles. I can add my own styles, as I'll show you here. So all I have to do is use style, and I want the max width to be 500 pixels. Save this, go back, and as you can see, it's squished down. Now if I want to reduce this even further, I can just type padding and make it be equal to 50 pixels. Save this, go back again, and as you can see, now it looks like an actual login form. I can put in some HTML, remember me, and I click on login and it will submit. But since it's not an email ID, click on login, and since it can't submit anyway, it just submits it to itself. And we have our code. So this is what it looks like. This is what Bootstrap looks like. In case you were wondering how did I got those styles, you can take a look at the documentation. You can take a look at the kind of form that we built. It's something that's exactly like we built here. You can take a look at the code. If you want to take a look at individual components, you can, such as checkboxes are here. You can click here and take a look at the checkboxes, how they are built, what are the classes that we need there, what these classes do. Everything is displayed here, so you can use them to your own advantage. Now, in case you have learned these things, these are the technologies that you can use. You can use Code Sandbox to build your form components. You can use React.js to build your user interface, and you can use Bootstrap to provide it with styling.
First, technology types. So Angular is full-fledged MVC framework which is written in JavaScript, whereas React.js is nothing but a JavaScript library, right? And guys, second parameter is that AngularJS was developed by Google in 2010, and in 2016, Angular team created AngularJS 2, which was pure copy of AngularJS, and it was actually a completed new framework. So in order to avoid the confusion from previous version, the Angular team decided to remove JS from the original name, and since then, this new framework is known as Angular. And in case of React.js, it was developed by Facebook in 2013, and since then it has been used as it is. And of course, with some changes and updates made regularly. Now the third parameter that we have is language used. In Angular, TypeScript consisting JavaScript plus HTML is used, whereas React.js uses JavaScript plus JSX, where JSX is nothing but an XML or HTML-like syntax used by React, which extends ECMA script so that XML or HTML-like text can coexist with the JavaScript or React code, right? Now the fourth parameter that we have is debugging and testing. In Angular, the testing and debugging for a complete project is possible via a single tool. But in case of React.js, it requires a set of tools in order to perform different types of testings. Now the fifth parameter, which is data binding. In Angular, two-way data binding method is followed, so it helps us to ensure that model state automatically changes if any change is made. Whereas React allows one-way data binding, that means the user interface elements can't be changed without updating the corresponding model state. Sixth parameter is the version. So guys, the latest stable version in Angular is 7.2.0. Since React always keeps on updating and making changes, so the latest stable version in React is React 16.7.0. Now in our 7th point, Angular is ideal to use if you want to develop large-scale, rich-featured applications, whereas in case of React, it is ideal to use for modern web development and native rendered apps for Android and iOS devices. Now moving on to our last parameter of this section, that is the learning curve, which can also be considered as difficulty of learning. So for beginners, learning Angular is not at all easy. A lot of training is required, whereas React is easy to grasp. How did I conclude this? That we'll discuss in this session as we move forward. Alright guys, so now let us discuss about the pros and cons of using both of these technologies. First and foremost, pros of using Angular. So guys, code written in this is comparatively cleaner and structured, right? It offers higher performance and error is handled in a better manner. It has material design like interface. Angular framework takes care of routing. That means if you want to move from one view to another, it will be easier. And in case of cons of using Angular, if you're a beginner, then Angular features can be difficult and confusing for you. And Angular sometimes becomes slow with pages embedding interactive elements. If you want to integrate Angular with third party, then it will be really difficult. And if you want to switch from older versions to the newer ones, then you may face several difficulties or issues, right? So moving forward to our next point, that is pros of using React.js as well as cons, right? First, discussing pros, it has better user experience. It is easy to launch and has faster development. If you're using React.js, then it will be a lot more time saver than Angular. It has code stability and one-directional data binding. It also allows you to use third-party libraries, right? Now, let us discuss cons of using React.js. So if you want to integrate React in traditional MVC framework like Rail, then it needs complex configuration and setup. And the React's users would be expected to have in-depth knowledge with respect to the integration of user interface into MVC framework. So guys, as we discussed previously, now let us understand the learning curve, or in other words, the difficulty level of learning Angular and React.js. So guys, learning curve or difficulty level of learning plays a very important role when it comes to choosing a new or a trending technology. So let me tell you, if you're a beginner and want to learn Angular, then it will need a lot of efforts as Angular is a full-fledged framework. So guys, if you're looking for making a project or an application, there are certain things you need to learn. You need to go through TypeScript thoroughly with all the concepts clear, right? And MVC, Model View Controller Framework, you need to have a grasp over it, right? And other concepts like directives, modules, decorators, services, components, dependency, injection, pipe, templates, and a lot more, right? Another important thing is that it has very strict coding structure. But if you want to enter into Angular's world, then you have to learn a lot of many things, and the entry barrier is clearly higher in this compared to React.js. On the other side, React.js is just a JavaScript library, and so it has lesser concepts to learn in the comparison of Angular. You don't need to be a programming expert in order to learn React.js. It uses JavaScript XML, that is JSX, right? JSX is nothing but a way of writing HTML into JavaScript, as I discussed earlier, right? So you just need to know certain things to learn React. I'll name a few of them, that is the syntax of JSX, how to write the components, how to manage internal state, routing, props of configuration, state management using Redux, and so on. Code written in React.js are simpler and easy to understand. You don't have to learn any loops or new logical structures in it, as it's a plain JavaScript. Another important difference is React provides flexibility and options to the developers to do the same task in different manner. But it definitely does not mean that React is better than Angular, right? Now moving on to another factor, which is popularity and growth of Angular versus React.js. So guys, before you go to the libraries or frameworks to use, it is really important to have a look at its popularity and growth. Popularity of a technology is directly proportional to the job opportunities, isn't it? Simply put, in most of the cases for more popular or trending technology, you can find more job demands. For better understanding, let us have a look at this data on our screen. So guys, if you observe here, you can see the significance difference. React obviously has more than double the amount of GitHub contributors and stars as compared to Angular. Another important factor you should consider is what Google Trends search hit says that about the popularity of these two as per the downloads and the visitors. Currently, React has around 10,000 more downloads than Angular. So according to the above metrics, it is crystal clear that React is more popular than Angular, right? Now, as we proceed forward, let us see where these technologies are used or the companies using them. So high-scale companies are using both React and Angular. I'll list down some of the biggest brands and companies in the world that are using them. For Angular, Google, Nike, Sony, Forbes, General Motors, Upworks, HBO, and the list goes on, right? In the case of React, you can see that Facebook, Airbnb, Instagram, WhatsApp, Netflix, Dropbox, Uber, again, the list goes on. You must have observed by now that working in these two technologies is not at all a cup of tea, right? So now we have the mobile solutions offered by both Angular and React.js. So guys, both Angular and React can be used for creating mobile applications, and in order to develop the hybrid mobile applications in Angular, Ionic framework is used, and Ionic uses a Cordova container which is incorporated with Angular. Ionic provides a robust UI component library that is easy to set up and develop the hybrid mobile applications. Hence, if you see the created applications on any gadget, it seems like a web app inside a local web application holder, right? So the apps can be quite slower. In React.js, React Native platform is used for creating native mobile applications. Syntax used in React Native is slightly different from Ionic's syntax. React Native produces a local user interface which allows its developers to make their own paths or components and tie them to the local code, which can be written in Kotlin, Java, or Swift, etc. As we move further, let us discuss about the next factor, which is testing tools and their usage in Angular and React.js. Right guys? So in Angular, Jasmine and Karma, etc. are the testing framework which can be used. And in Angular IO, a single tool can be used for testing and debugging the complete project. Hence, the output is very difficult to read in such scenarios. Whereas Facebook uses Jest tool to test its React code, right? One additional benefit to use this tool is it does not require any configuration to use, and it is included in every React project. Jest also contains powerful mocking library. Most of the time, Jest is used in combination with Enzyme, which is a JavaScript testing utility, also used in Airbnb. So in React.js, set of tools are used for performing different set of testing. Now let's move forward and discuss about their code style and syntax. In React, code is written using JSX plus JavaScript. In most cases, JSX just looks like the HTML. Let's have a look at the code from testingprogram.jsx, where we are returning div, right? And it is a simple hello world program. Note that React has some different kinds of components, but here we have started with React.component subclasses or child class. So guys, that's how our React code looks like. Looks easy, right? So now in Angular, you can write a hello world program like you can see that testingprogram.js file, right? So guys, as you observe here, the code to write a simple hello world is little complex than our React's code, right? In case of Angular, isn't it? So syntax of Angular is quite lengthy as compared to React.js, isn't it? Now, as we have discussed about their difficulty levels.
Just a quick info guys. Intellipaat provides ReactJS online training mentored by industry experts. The course link is given in the description below. Now let's continue with the session. Just a quick info guys. Test your knowledge of ReactJS by answering this question. What is ReactJS? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
So, the roles in web development. before we actually look at the rules, let us look at the brief definition of what web development is. It is a process to build web applications that users can access using web browsers. So this could be from multiple devices like TVs, smartphones, desktop computers. So any device, any smart device that virtually has access to a web browser, the process to create web applications for those devices is called web development. So the first job role associated with this process, and the most important one as well, is backend development. So backend development is also known as server-side development. Backend, also known as server-side, is the part of the web application that deals with the data and the relationships. Backend can be built using many languages. Some of these include, so you might be familiar with these, PHP. It is an old language used for creating server-side scripts. Python is a comparatively new language with a lot of libraries and frameworks available to develop servers. And then we have Ruby. So you might be familiar with Ruby on Rails. Node.js, it is a JavaScript-based server technology. And then Java. So Java, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So these are some of the languages, most prominent ones used for server-side development. And then obviously we have front-end development. So this is what the users see. This is the part that deals with the user interface. So in front-end development, it is defined as the client side. It is the part of the web application that the user interacts with. It mainly consists of three technologies that are prominent today: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So these are the elements. These are essentially the bread and butter of front-end web development. So let us look at what HTML is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is used to define the structure and the elements of a web page. And then to style the HTML pages that we create, we use CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is used to define the style and layout of a web page. And then to add some sort of a dynamic element to your web page, you use JavaScript. JavaScript is used to add interactivity and asynchronous communication to a web page. So elements like drop-down menus or interactive chats, they are built using JavaScript. There are additional frameworks and libraries that can be added on top of this. So the front-end framework. So in the front-end frameworks, basically they are libraries of code that take care of a lot of commonly built features in a front-end framework. So among the most popular ones today, we have AngularJS, we have React, and we have Vue. So these are some of the most popular JavaScript-based front-end frameworks that we use today. So we're going to be discussing about React today, not all of these three. And then finally, there is the full stack development job role. So if you are familiar with both backend and frontend, if you are proficient with both, then you go for the full stack development role. So it is used when a developer is expected to know and work with both front-end and back-end technologies and databases. So it's always a plus to know both of these. So the front-end should be known by you, and the back-end, the server development, should be known by you. And then to integrate the backend with the database and handling the database, this is also a knowledge base that you should have when you're dealing with full stack development. So databases is also a technology that you should be familiar with. So in the front-end frameworks that we had discussed earlier, there are advantages to all of them: Angular, React, and Vue. But we will discuss today why ReactJS is a framework of choice for a lot of developers out there. So let us talk about React first. It is a front-end JavaScript framework created by Facebook. So essentially in all of the Facebook technologies that you see today, it mainly deals with the efficient rendering of components based on the current application state that you have. And there are various advantages associated to it. So let us look at the elements that make ReactJS such a favorable language. So the first is the JSX. JSX is a subcomponent that is present in React.js. JSX has a format very similar to HTML, and it renders just the same. So when you write JSX, you can write it in the way you would write HTML. But the main advantage that you get with JSX is that you can implement JavaScript logic within that HTML code, and it will simply render that logic onto your web browser as well. So integrating the logic, your JavaScript logic with frontend to reduce the server overhead. So you don't have to send requests to your server to get some data back. You can calculate it on the client side itself. And then we have components. So the code reusability factor and the easy to maintain factor come with components. So the way React works is that you write components instead of writing whole pages. You write components and then you can reuse those components. You can call those components like functions and implement it wherever you need to implement it. So say if you have a drop-down menu and you want to implement it in a certain section of your web page, you can simply call for that drop-down menu function and it will basically be rendered onto your web page. And the way components make the code becomes very structured. So it's very easy to maintain as well. So say if you want to perform a feature update, so you just go to the component that you want to make changes to, you make changes to that code, or you branch it out and you make changes to that code, and then you push the code back in, and then your feature is implemented without hindering any other code. So it's very easy to maintain as well, very easy to update. And then obviously React.js is a fast framework. It is stable and it is SEO friendly. So technologies, front-end technologies that are built using React, when you're searching for them, searching for certain keywords, certain elements with Google, it's very SEO friendly. So the search results would come up very easily. So what is the average salary of a React.js developer now that we know why React.js is favored? So there's also a quite hefty sum attached to it. In the US, the average salary of a React.js developer is $120,000. In India, it's 7.3 lakhs per annum. And in the UK, it's a pretty nice 57,000 pounds. So these are the average salaries of a React.js developer. So once you get to an experienced state, this is what you can get out of it. And this is only based on front-end technologies. If you transition to a full stack role, the possibilities are endless. So now that we know the salary of a React.js developer, let us look at the job description that is involved in a React.js developer role. So firstly, the candidate should be familiar with developing user interface components and implementing them with well-known React.js workflows like Flux or Redux. The candidate should be familiar with building reusable components and libraries for future use. So the main advantage of React.js is that we can reduce the lines of code in our web application, make it lighter with the use of components. So the components that you would build as part of your front end element, those components should be reusable in other places as well. So that is a very favorable point when you're applying for a React.js developer role. Being able to translate design into high quality code. So this is a quality that should be there in every front end developer, not just a React.js developer. So you should be able to look at a design and find out the most efficient way to implement it in your front end code. Optimizing components for time and memory usage. So your components should be optimized in a way that they don't take a lot of client side resources. So they should be optimized for time efficiency and memory efficiency. Ensuring components are well defined, robust, and easy to maintain. So the components should be well documented, well defined. There should be proper camel casing and variable definitions. They should be robust, and all of this would make it easy to maintain as well when you're dealing with teams, developer teams, and whatnot. and then coordinating with the front end team to ensure component integration. So it might be the case that you're working on one component and your teammate is working on another component. So you should be able to coordinate with your teammates in order for those two components to be very easily integratable. Coordinating with the backend team to ensure application architecture implementation. So whatever the architecture design is provided to you for your web application, you have to ensure that that architecture is followed by coordinating with the backend team. And lastly, it's making the UI components that you build very easily accessible via multiple devices. So you're not just building your, in most cases today that you will deal with for websites. Websites develop their web pages for the desktop browser, for smart TV browsers, for mobile phone browsers. So your components should be coded in a way that they are optimized for all of these elements, so that when you open your components using a mobile phone, you should be able to see it in a way that it's fitting the aspect ratio of your phone, and all of the UI elements are optimized according to it. So that is a great sign of a React.js developer. And the skills that would be required of you when you're applying for these roles is you should know HTML, CSS, you should be familiar with JavaScript, obviously. And once you've learned JavaScript, you should also know React.js, because you're applying for a React.js developer role. Flux or Redux, so these are workflows that you should be familiar with. Basic Node.js, I'll get to why you should know basic Node.js when you're applying for a React.js developer role in a moment. And then one or the other version control technology. So my recommendation would be Git. You should be familiar with Git as a version control technology. So let us look at some of the companies that are hiring React.js developers. So these are some of the top tier companies that are hiring for React.js. So you have Facebook, Netflix, Instagram, you have the New York Times, you have Yahoo, you have WhatsApp, Twitter, and Salesforce. So these are just some of the companies. Obviously, you can see all of the Facebook owned companies here. So you have Facebook, you have Instagram, you have WhatsApp and such. And you have other companies as well. There are a lot of companies that are hiring for React.js at the moment. So it's a very popular technology. So let us look at the learning path, or in other words, how to become a React.js developer. So the first thing that you would need to know is HTML. So HTML is the first thing that any web developer ever knows. So it's what you see. It's the basis of internet technologies today. The basis of static web pages. Whatever you see on your web browser essentially is a render of the HTML code that your web browser is making. So that is what you're seeing. Then after you have the base concepts of HTML covered, you're quite familiar with all of the elements that are present in HTML. Then you would get to CSS. Now CSS is a tricky bit. In CSS, you should be familiar with it to a very high extent, but you don't need to be proficient at writing CSS code, because in 90% front-end jobs that you would get today, you wouldn't be required to write flat-out CSS, but you should know what the CSS does so that you can make appropriate changes to it. So that is what your knowledge in CSS should be about. You should be very familiar with how to make changes to it. And what changes would do what in CSS, but you don't necessarily need to know how to code CSS from scratch. And then you have JavaScript. So once you're familiar with HTML and CSS, then you go on to JavaScript too. And when you move on to JavaScript, it's essentially when you need to add some sort of an interactable element to your web page. So then you move on to JavaScript, you implement some logic on your web page. And then when you're sort of proficient in JavaScript, then you can easily move on to React.js. And it wouldn't take much of a time to transition into React.js once you're familiar with vanilla JavaScript. Then after you've learned React.js, you've understood how it works, then you can get into how to implement it in a professional environment. So most of the organizations that are using React.js today follow either of the two workflows like Flux or Redux. So you should be familiar with these data flows in order to implement React.js in a professional organizational environment. And then when you're familiar with all of these, when you've built some hands-on and projects and all of this, then you're essentially ready for jobs. Then you can apply for jobs, right? And one other thing that I would like to add is a technology that is very handy after learning all of this, or even in your learning procedure. It's Node.js. So I'll tell you why Node.js is important. So the reason it is important is that when you're practicing React.js, right, you need to be able to deploy your server in order for the React.js code to display, right? You need to be able to deploy your website so that you can see your front end, right? You can't just directly see your front end. You need to have a server for that. So React.js works with Node.js. So you need to know basics of Node.js as to how to deploy it into servers in order for you to test your React.js knowledge. So that is the only requirement for Node.js if you're purely applying for a front-end role. But obviously, if you're applying for a back-end role or a full-stack developer role, then you need to be extremely familiar with Node.js, because then you need to be able to integrate both of these very efficiently.
So let's begin this React.js interview questions with one of the very important questions that is mostly asked in all of these interviews. So to begin with, we have the question which states, differentiate between virtual DOM and real DOM. So DOM, as you already might know it, as the document object model. And there is a specific working with respect to React on virtual DOM and the usage of real DOM as well. So more on that in the next couple of questions. But then the answer for this question, the way you're supposed to approach this is very simple. Just give them the concise difference between the virtual DOM and the real DOM. For example, when you consider working with virtual DOM, it is actually a little bit easier in terms of usability rather than real DOM. And then there's a lot of memory wastage which happens whenever you work with JavaScript objects. And here, when you're making use of virtual DOM, memory is not wasted as much as it would in the case of real DOM as well. And then when we talk about the JavaScript XML elements, which is also called as the JSX elements, it will only be updated every time if an element actually exists for it. But then in the real DOM, that's not actually the case. In real DOM, what happens is every time there's a new element that gets updated, right, a new DOM itself is created for it, and then an object is processed and later passed on to JavaScript and then the browser and all of that. So in terms of the backend working efficiency as well, a virtual DOM has a bit of the higher picture here. And then when you talk about the ability for either the virtual DOM or the real DOM to manipulate HTML directly, well, here real DOM might have an advantage because it has the ability to directly manipulate HTML, while virtual DOM cannot manipulate HTML directly. And then when you think about compilation and the actual updates being shown, virtual DOM will update faster than the real DOM, and you will understand why in the next couple of questions, as we'll be dealing with virtual DOM a bit later. This brings us to question number 2. Question number 2 states, what is React? Well, React is one of the world's most popular JavaScript library as of now. It was originally launched in 2011. It was created by the developers at Facebook, and it was mostly meant to provide a nice pipeline for very good front-end development, right? So creating front-end elements is not only complex, but at the end of the day, it has to be simplified to a point where you can efficiently work with the tool. Well, React was this particular implementation. It is based on a component based approach where you try to build each components and make sure that the reusability of these components are very high, in a way where you can take these components out and make a lot of things with a lot less, if I have to put it in a very simple way. So React gained a lot of traction since 2011, and no doubt it is one of the number one JavaScript libraries out there. And for this reason, you can develop a lot of complex stuff, be it mobile interfaces, web applications, or even designing anything complex, right? So with React, it makes it all very simple. So when you're asked this question, make sure you mention all of these to add a little bit of value to your answer, rather than just saying that React is a JavaScript library, right? So saying it out this way will add value to your candidature. Now, coming to question number 3, it says, what is the meaning of virtual DOM? As we just discussed in the first question, so to give you more clarity about this, a virtual DOM is nothing but a simple JavaScript object. So a virtual object is an exact copy of a real DOM, where it can be considered as a tree, and it can be considered as a node tree which has all these things such as elements, it has attributes, it has properties attached, and much more. So if you picture a node tree right now, where each of these branches can branch out into elements and their attributes and the properties, that is what the virtual DOM would look like. And then when you think about React uses something called as the render function, where it actually creates a tree, it updates the tree based on the changes that happen in real time, with respect to the data model, and then present the changes that you have done out to the browser, right? So it is very similar to this, and virtual DOM is in fact used for that as well. And then when you think about all the changes, either performed by the users, or if there is an action which has led to a cause, which changes something, then again the render function is called, the virtual DOM is put into use, the object is used, and then the working of it goes on in an order, as we'll check out in the next couple of questions. Coming to question number 4, it states, what are some of the important features of React? This question can be answered in many ways, because React has so many different features that you can talk about. You can go on 10 minutes with the answer for this particular questions. But then the most simple way I would suggest is to pick out features that'll help you portray the uniqueness of React, right? So I have 3 points on your screen that you can use to add a lot of value. The first thing is, it says React makes use of a single directional data flow model. Again, this is only native to React while its development was, and it is in a league of its own. The single directional data flow model works very effectively. It's very rapid, and it is used to just make the entire process of designing and developing a front-end solution very efficient. And then when we talk about the ability for the front-end development language to have control over server side of things, well, yes, React has the ability to completely control the server side data processing abilities, the handling of it, and then merging it in terms of creating a pipeline where you'll be using it for your front-end requirement as well. And of course, we spoke about virtual DOMs. So React uses virtual DOMs, and this in its own stages has multiple advantages as well. So you can name 3 or 4 points which makes React very unique in a way where your answer is concise and you keep it precise at the same time. Now this brings us to question number 5, which states, what is the meaning of JSX? JSX, as I just previously told you, is the abbreviation for JavaScript XML. So it's nothing but a very simple file which is used in React to make sure that you hold together this essence of JavaScript and React in a way where there's a lot of advantages of using these together. So, when you think about working with HTML and JavaScript, a JSX file is basically used to bring out the HTML file, make sure you have the ability to make use of the HTML syntax in a very simple way. And at the end of the day, of course, yes, the syntax is, very readable in a way where you can understand a lot of things even without having to know what it does exactly. And with this comes efficient programming and, of course, good performance to the application. If you have to take a look at an XML file, JavaScript XML file, there's a quick sample on your screen right now. There's a render function we're returning where we're printing the h1 header to be hello Intellipaat learners, right? So this is a very simple XML file, the JavaScript XML file, and in most of the cases it is as readable as this. Even though there's only 3 or 4 lines, even with more lines, a JSX file is very much readable, and you can very much contemplate and understand what's going on there as well. Now with this, we come to question number 6. Question number 6 states, can browsers read a JSX file? The answer you have to begin with very simply is no. Directly, browsers cannot have access and read JSX files, right? So what basically happens is, whenever there's a browser which needs some changes to be portrayed to the screen and it has to be rendered by the JavaScript programming languages, the browser can only read an object, and this object is directly provided by JavaScript. Now, the case comes in a way where if you answer no, then how do you make a browser read a JavaScript file? It will be the follow-up question you will be asked if you say no. So to explain that aspect of it as well, to make a browser actually read a JSX file, it has to be first converted into a JavaScript object using something called as JSX transformers, and only after using JSX transformers can they actually be shown to the browser, and the browser making sense of it as a JavaScript object, and then it'll work further down the pipeline. So unless your browser sees the JavaScript object, it cannot understand JSX files directly, guys. So with this, we come to question number 7. Question number 7 states, why is React so widely used today, right? So from 2011, from the developers of Facebook, it has been seen a lot of traction, and a lot of people are jumping on React, not only for its ability to create very good environments, working environments, easy ability to work with other frameworks, or whatever it is. It has created a plethora of job openings, in fact, and that is one of the reasons why everyone wants to get on the React train, because they know this is one of the top development frameworks out there, right? So if you make use of it, and if you want to build a career in it, it could be very lucrative at the same time. Now, coming to some of the features of why React is actually widely used, you have to understand that testing is a very, very important part about development frameworks, right? So here as well, with React, making use of testing methodologies for your user interface becomes extremely easy. And the another important thing is that React can talk very easily and work very well with other frameworks such as Angular, Vue.js, and much more. And coming to point number 3, we're talking about readability of code from that time, right? So the ability of you to understand the code as soon as you look at it is very, very high, which makes sure that you can have an easy understanding of what's going on with the code and help you work in an effective way as well. And now when you talk about how React is being used for both front-end and server-side requirements, where it has the ability to plan, maintain, hold some data and then work with it, well, here is the biggest advantages of why React is being considered today. And at the end of it, of course, with all of these applications comes very good performance, and with all these features, it brings about a sense of efficiency which no other framework has seen before. So this is one of the reasons why React is considered to be as popular as it is today. Now coming to question number 8, this is a common question as well. This question has a very high probability of being asked. If you keep on talking about the advantages of React, the interviewer can ask you about any disadvantages with respect to React as well. No matter the amount of advantages, even though they outweigh the amount of disadvantages directly, there are some limitations when you talk about React. So since we're making use of JavaScript XML here and something called as inline template formatting, what happens is that whenever you're writing code, it tends to become a bit complicated at times. And especially for beginners, it'll be very difficult for you guys, even though the syntax might be very readable, but then this syntax is complex on its own to understand its structure as well. So with respect to that, understanding methodologies, JSX and everything, beginners can find it a little tough to work with these as well. And then we're talking about React. React contains a huge repository of information where you have to learn a lot before implementing. And of course, your implementations are going to be very powerful, but then to get there, you really need to have a lot of knowledge and information, right? So that can get a little overwhelming as well. And then we're only talking about learnability, but then when you really have to concentrate about the simplicity of React, yes, it is simple. And this poses as a disadvantage because it is not a complete framework. So you will have to have certain dependencies along with React. And of course, if you have to use them together, it means that you have to learn whatever it is required of the dependency and learn React at the same time as well. Even though it sounded like an advantage at the first half, now you get the clear picture of what some of these disadvantages of React are.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of React.js by answering this question. What is React.js? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
This brings us to question number 9, which is a very simple question. It says differentiate between Angular and React. Well, both of them are amazing frameworks, right? So when we talk about Angular was actually developed by Google, while React was created by Facebook. The usage of DOM, Angular uses the real DOM and React makes use of the virtual DOM. And then when we're talking about rendering, rendering happens on the client side with respect to Angular, and on the server side when we talk about React. The architecture is again a very simple one. Angular provides support for model view controller. The complete MVC support is provided, while React only provides the view aspect of the model view controller. So when you have to talk about data binding, Angular takes a bit of a sidestep here because it only supports unidirectional data binding, while React has the ability to completely support and champion two-way data binding as well. So you really don't have to explain a lot when you're asked about Angular and React, because at the end of the day, these two frameworks are meant for their own niche uses, and both of them are really good at what they do. So just make sure you highlight the basic differences, the actual differences that lie in between them, and that should be more than enough to get you on to the next question. And the next question states, what is the meaning of the component based architecture of React? So one very important thing about React you have to understand is that every single entity is considered to be a component, and these components are like the foundations which are used for building user interfaces for web applications. So when you have a component based system, what happens is that every single entity will become completely reusable in a way where so you can move it around, replace it, and once it has the ability to become independent of each other, right? So this is when you are extremely efficient while programming itself, and your application becomes efficient in a way where it can reuse the components rather than having like 10 components in the place of one, which would again cause very high redundancy, which is not good for programming and which is not good for execution as well. And then when you think about rendering the applications with a component based architecture, the rendering becomes very easy and it does not depend on any other components of the same user interface as well. So when you think about it, again, it's completely a huge advantage for React, and it is only because of the component based architecture. So with this, we can move on to question number 11. Question number 11 states, how does rendering work in React? Rendering is a very, very important aspect of React, as you might already know it, as every single component that exists in React, if it has to be seen by the user or by the browser, it has to be rendered. And rendering in React can be done by using a function of the same name, which is the render function. So what actually happens is whenever there's a function that is called, right? So after it is called, it returns an element that actually represents a DOM component. And what happens here is that if you're wondering, can we, have more than one HTML element at a time to be rendered to make sure that it is efficient? Well, yes, it is possible to render more than one HTML element. And how is this done? This is done by taking all the HTML tags, enclosing these tags, and then passing it all to the render function one by one to make sure that they execute concurrently as well. So rendering is a very important aspect, and this is why. So coming to the 12th question, it states, what are the states in React? So states is something which is very important you have to understand about React as well, because it is one of these vital things, because it is the source of data, or it can be considered as the objects which control various aspects such as component behavior, component rendering, and much more. So states, as the name suggests itself, is used to easily create these interactive components that we like in all React applications, and of course to create the dynamic applications as well. So as a serving foundation, states is very vital in the working of React. With this, we can come to question number 13, which states, what are the props? So what are the meaning of props in React? Well, props are actually a short name given for properties in React. So whenever there's properties we talk about in React, all of these are read-only components which are completely immutable in nature. So they cannot be changed as and when you require in real time, right? So whenever there's an application, what actually happens is that, there are properties which have an order that is passed down to them from, let's say, the parent components to the child components, and then these properties are matched to each other and then used. But then if you're wondering, can we have child components which can assign properties to parent components? Well, no, that cannot be done. This is done only to make sure of the concept that we already discussed. It's called as the single directional data flow. So to keep the data flowing only in one direction, even in this case, to keep the data flowing from the parent components to the child components and the properties associated with them, props are very vital to be used in React as well. And then coming to the 14th question, it states, what is the use of an arrow function in React? So you might have used the arrow function, or you might know how to use the arrow function as well. So it is a very simple expression that is used in React in case if you have the requirement where you have to bind certain components manually. The functioning is very simple, it is very direct, and it is very helpful when you're working with something called as higher ordered functions as well. Again, we have another question for higher ordered functions as well, so we'll check that out there. But then coming to the usual example of where you have to manually bind components, you can see my input on change equal to this dot handle change and bind this. This is how you manually bind it, right? Now there's a fun way if you make use of the arrow function. So instead of directly saying it that way, all you can do is to enclose the function and use the arrow function, as you can see on your screen right here. So this arrow function is another way where you can use it. Here in this example, of course, the syntax is very simple, but then if binding your components can get complex when you're using a large piece of code, this will simplify it to a very good extent. With this, we can come to question number 15. Question number 15 states, what is a higher order component, right? So as we just discussed in the previous question, higher order component is a component, yes, but then when we talk about it in general, it is actually a technique that is put in place for React, where we make use of this entire architecture based on something which we already discussed, right? So it's the component reusability logic. So to apply all of these components, we have something called as the higher order components. And one thing that you should always mention while answering this question is that they are actually not a native part of the React API at all. And what actually happens here is that it will allow the users to reuse whatever piece of code that is required, have some Bootstrap abstractions if required, and much more. And it's not only this. With higher order components, what happens is that it will allow for very, very simple sharing of any sort of behaviors between the components in the component structure. And then doing this, again, we will circle back to one very important thing about React, is that it will give way for high efficiency and easy functioning of the applications. Well, with this, we can move on to the 16th question, which states, what is the meaning of create React app in React? Well, the create React app in React itself, it is actually nothing but a very simple CLI. A CLI is a command line interface where you can use it to create React applications where you have no build configuration. And using this is very simple in a way where all of the tools come predefined and pre-configured with the CLI. So doing this is mainly advantageous for you as a developer, because at the end of the day, you will be having the ability to concentrate more on the code, more on the logic, on the dependencies, rather than how you can work with syntax or the complexity of actually building the application and much more, right? So it's a simple CLI, and you can use the syntax shown on your screen to start a very simple project in React as well. It's called create React app space my app. My app is being the name of the simple project that you want to start. So with this, we can come to the next question that states, what are some of the advantages of using create React app in React? So we saw what it is, but then it has certain advantages which make it stand out as well. So, with Create React App, one very important thing is that it has the direct support for JavaScript XML, flow statements, and ES6 statements as well. So with this, what it will do is it will make sure that it is very simple for you to work with without worrying on a large piece of code that happens in the backend. And of course, it will provide you fast interactive testing components and line development servers, which are very, very, very vital when you're working with debugging as well. And you get direct scripts which have the ability to handle JSS, CSS, and any other file that's required as well. And then your CSS is already auto prefix, it is ready, it is built in, and you can use it thoroughly as well. So with these 5 or 6 points that you can mention for the advantages of using the Create React app, and then this will make sure that that you're proving to the interviewer that you do have a concrete understanding of the foundational concepts involved in React as well. Coming to the 18th question. In the 18th question states, what is the meaning of Redux? Redux is again a very important aspect of React in a way where Redux is actually used to store individual states of these applications. So every single application will have a state, and then to keep it very simple, we have to store it in a single entity, and using Redux we do just this. So if you're thinking about, is Redux a JavaScript object by now? The answer is yes. This entity that gets stored into the state of that holds the state of an application is actually a JavaScript object. So changing the states can be done whenever you're pushing out any actions from the applications, or whenever you are writing the corresponding objects for these particular actions, mapping them while you're modifying their states as well. So a simple Redux object to show on your screen: first name is John, last name is Kelly, age is 25. So to retain this first name, last name, age in a state in a single entity, this is where the JavaScript object called Redux comes into the picture. So all of the data that gets retained by the Redux, so sometimes there is another name for it. The interviewer might ask for a store. So well, a Redux store, or it is just called as a store where the data is basically stored. Now with this we come to the 19th question, which states, what is the difference between props and states? Props we already saw, it's as properties. States we already checked out as well. So there are certain simple differences that we can check out in the conditions. See, for example, the ability to perform any changes in child components. For the properties, yes, you can change it. With respect to states, you cannot change the child components. Now, can the parent components change values? In the case of props, yes, they can change it for their child components. In the case of states, no. So then what can states do in these conditions that we're talking about, right? So each individual component, can changes be done inside each individual component? So that is where, when you ask that condition, of course with properties you cannot change, because then this defies the entire working architecture of properties and the component object model, right? So in the case of states, yes, changes can be made into the components, and this is one very simple yet elegant difference that you can put out when the interviewer asks you the difference between props and states. Now with this we come to the 20th question. The 20th question states, what are the three phases that is involved in the component lifecycle of React? This is a very common question. This is among the first top 10 questions you will always be asked if you're going into a React interview, because it's very simple at the end of the day, and it denotes your understanding of the concept. Because when we talk about the three phases of the component lifecycle, it involves initial rendering, updation, and the process of unmounting. With initial rendering, which is the first phase, this is where the entire process actually begins. The component goes to the DOM and all of that. And then when we talk about updations, this is where the component has the ability to be updated, the code to be changed, it has to be rendered again if required, and then it gets added onto the DOM. And the unmounting becomes the third important phase, where this involves the destruction of the component and its removal after it is not being used, after its rendering is done, and after it is no longer in the viewing base or the viewing platform of the user, right? So it has to be removed from the DOM to make sure the application is kept efficient as well. So first we render it, then we update it, and whatever gets updated and re-rendered gets into the DOM, and after which we have a component which we do not use, we remove it. It's pretty simple, guys. It's initial rendering, it's updation, and it's unmounting. So with this, we can check out the 21st question.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides ReactJS online training mentored by industry experts. The course link is given in the description below. Now let's continue with the session.
So the 21st question states, what are events in React? Events are these important things, probably the most important things that happen in the entire React architecture, right? So think about this. Whenever you perform any action, right? So like moving a mouse on the user interface of the application, or let's say pressing a key on the keyboard as well. So what all of these actions pertain to is that they'll trigger something called as an event. An event will then do a certain set of steps. It will perform a certain set of activities in response to these triggers, right? So the triggers are the mouse pressings, the mouse movements, or the key presses on the keyboard. Now, to perform certain activities in response to this is a good example of what events are. And think about the DOM architecture, and then when you think about the working of the DOM architecture, handling an event in React is very, very much similar. It's very much similar to that of the DOM architecture as well. So with this, we can come to question number 22, which states, how are events created in React? Now, it is always advantageous that you answer questions like these with a small snippet of code, right? So ask for a piece of paper, or in case if you have your laptop in front of you, just whip up a tiny piece of code where you can actually show how events are created in React as well. And they are created in a very simple way. First, we have the function where you'll have to put in the logic for the code, and then of course with the render function, the render functions, whatever is in the div that will be rendered, it will have a, and you have the functionality of the div as well. So on click this dot show click here, so the message click here will be displayed on it, and as soon as you click there, the code basically will go into the segment which is shown as code inside. So there you have to devise and work on the functionality of what response you should provide when a user would click on that button, for example. So with this, we can move on to question number 23. Question number 23 states, how is routing in React different from the conventional routing that takes place in other frameworks? It's very important that you understand the subtle differences that lie in between conventional routing and routing in React in two aspects. One, it's by using pages, where when you think about React, here every single page is actually a new file that gets moved around in conventional routing, in case if you used conventional routing, right? So but then in React this is not the case. Each view is not considered as a new file, in an explanation where all of these files become one single HTML entity. So instead of having a new file with the conventional routing methodologies, here we have one single HTML entity that can deal with all of these. So that's with respect to pages. And then when you have to talk about navigation, right? So in the case of conventional routing, users will manually have to move across different web pages to probably view different things. And every time this is done, the view model is basically refreshed, right? So whenever you click on different pages, every time the website gets refreshed, the application gets refreshed. In the case of React, that is not the case. The view will remain the same. The view is not refreshed because of only one important thing, is that the objects are reissued here to create new views, and new objects are not created here, guys. So creation of new objects, updation of the DOM model will create a scenario where the page automatically refreshes when you click on the new website, but in the case of React that does not happen. So this is a very important difference between conventional routing and the routing that happens when you use React. Coming to question number 24, it states, what's the difference between Flux and Redux in React? Well, we're going to check out Flux and React both in detail, but then to answer this question in a very concise way, you can name about 4 or 5 points where, in case if you're talking about Flux, it contains the logic and the state of the applications in the same place, where when we're talking about Redux, that is not the case. The logic and the states are stored in separate places. And then when we talk about states, Flux has mutable state. It can be changed while updation in real time, while with respect to Redux, the states are immutable. And then when we talk about the number of stores, we spoke about stores a bit before. Flux has only one store and Redux has many stores. And then if you're talking about a dispatcher or a handler, Flux does have a dispatcher, while React does not come with dispatchers. And then of course components. Components are connected to Flux in React directly. And then when we talk about Redux, of course, since we're talking about Redux, the container components are directly connected, guys. So, when you think about the basic differences that exist between Flux and React, one is the presence of a dispatcher, the other one is the ability to have multiple stores, the data being mutable, the states being mutable more precisely, and then the separation in the storage of the states and the logic. So these 4-5 points are found to be the foundational differences between Flux and Redux in React. Let's come to question number 25. Question number 25 states, can Ajax be used with React? So the first thing you have to start out with your answer with when you have a question like this is either yes or no. And in this case, the answer is yes, because just like any Ajax library where you have jQuery Ajax, you have Axios, or any of these libraries, you can use this very easily with React. But to do this, you have to remember one very important thing is that every single component has states, and you have to maintain the states here, because properties are again passed down to the parent, to the child components, and to make sure you maintain all these properties and that they are correct. And with React, you will lose the ability to move data in two directions, right? So it's unidirectional. So once the props sent from the parents to the children, then there is no way to send the props back to the parents, right? So this is one thing which is an advantage in terms of workability, and of course in terms of rendering efficiency. It'll have a huge impact whenever we're working with dynamic data. So the answer is yes to this particular question. With this, we can move on to the 26th question that states, what is the meaning of synthetic events in React? We checked out what events are, but then what are synthetic events? What you have to understand about synthetic events are, yes, even they are objects, and the simple thing is that they act as cross-browser wrappers. So what this does is this will allow the users the ability to make use of any of the native events in React alongside this as well. So why is this done? Why do we even require cross-browser wrappers, right? So this is done only to increase compatibility. So by doing this, you can make sure that your API can run across a variety of browsers and that it does not become browser dependent. So if a piece of code or an application works well on, say, Google Chrome, but then if it fails to work on Safari, it really doesn't make sense, right? So to make sure that the ability of React has the outreach of multiple browsers, we use these synthetic events to do that for us in a very, very simple way. Now with this, we come to question number 27 that states, what are stateful components in React? Stateful component, as the name suggests, are entities which have the ability to store any changes that happens to them and hold it in a place of memory. Stateless components will not have any states because they will not have the ability to store the changes that happen or hold them in memory. But then stateful components, yes, they can store all the changes. So whatever change in state, it is stored along with other information, such as what are the changes that happened in the past. There'll be a document for that. What are the current changes that are taking place while the document is being executed and active rendering is taking place, and of course there will be documentation of in case any future changes do occur as well. So stateful components play a very vital role in the working of React. And then this brings us to the 28th question. The 28th question states, what are refs in React? And again, as you might have already known, refs is actually a shorthand for references. So whenever we talk about any sort of references in React, they used to store the reference to either one single React element or store references to a React component. And what and why we do this is to only make sure that we can return it later using the render function to, let's say, if you have any good animations that you have to run, imperative animations that keep running either on a loop or any rapid animations. Then of course, so references are mainly used in case if you have third-party DOM libraries that you have to work with. And of course, one very important use of refs is to make sure you have the ability to manage focus and apply media playback to your web application or on your website for it to render as well. So mostly it is used in the case of media, animation, images and videos. But then one very important thing to mention is that it is also used to join third-party DOM libraries. Well, with this, we can move on to the 29th question that states, what are controlled components in React? We checked out what components are, stateful components are, but what are controlled components, right? So controlled components will always refer to the components that have the ability to maintain their state, same as stateful components. And here the data is actually controlled by a parent component. So this is a child component in the first person's perspective. And when we talk about this, the whatever value is present here is fetched only by making use of the props that it gets from its parent component. So why is this done? This is done only to make sure to quickly notify if there are any new changes that occurs when we're using callback functions while rendering. This at the end of the day will simplify about 5 or 6 other steps that need to be done in case we do not make use of control components. It makes sure that the code is simple and effective to work with for you as a developer and React as a programming framework as well. Now, when we talk about the 30th question, one very important aspect that we have to cover in this particular interviews questions segment is, why is a router required in React? Router is something which is very important, as you'll see, and this is a question which is again very, very important in a React interview. So when you think about routers, well, routers are extremely efficient components, when we talk about React, because when we add that onto our URL, the user is taken from one particular component, and it's basically like mapping out a route for the components. So once you have a component of framework where you can actually, walk through each of these components in a particular order, in a particular route, well, this is why it's got the name router. And there's a simple piece of syntax on your screen right now that denotes the usage of the router library. And of course, since we're using router, the library has to be added in React, and of course it can be done using this syntax. So we have the route exact path, we're defining the path, the component is the home component, then we have another component, new post and post. As you can see, we are routing it manually from home to new post to post, right? So the router is mainly required for this purpose. Now with this, we come to the 31st question. So the 31st question states, what are the components of Redux in React, right? So one very important thing that you have to keep in mind while answering this question is that Redux comes with 4 very important components. It's action, it's the reducer, it's store, and it's view. So action is an object that actually describes a call. Reducer will actually denote the state change that happens in the storage unit. Store, on the other hand, will denote the state and the object tree storage, while view displays the data that is provided by the store. So the features of the components go very hand in hand with their name. So an action will describe the call, the reducer will show the state change that happens in the storage unit, the store will denote the object tree storage and the states as well, and then the view will display the data provided. You have to remember the components, and in case if you do not know, just recall the names of it, and once you get the names, it is pretty easy to understand what it does and then convey the same to the interviewer as well. With this, we can come to the 32nd question that states, what are the advantages of making use of Redux? Well, there are numerous advantages of making use of Redux, but then to keep it very simple here, we've picked up the top 4 advantages of making use of Redux. One, when you talk about organized approach, right? So Redux requires code that has to be organized, and doing this will make sure that the code is consistent, the code is easy to work with, and it is structured at the same time. So to make use of this, your code has to be organized. And then when we talk about the testability or the testing ability in general, Redux functions are very isolated. They are extremely small to work with, and testing a small piece of code is very much easier, very much quicker than working with a large piece of code and then testing it later. And then when we talk about tools, developers can actually track actions and all of the tools in React by making use of Redux easily, and they do not have to put a lot of effort to do this. And then when we talk about the community aspect of things, Redux has a large community. This is an open source community, both React and Redux. So in case if you do require any help of working with Redux, or if you're stuck with any aspect of it, of course there are users who are out there who are ready to help you, and you can even get libraries built up in case if you do have a niche application as well. So in terms of community as well, there's a very big advantages of using Redux. Now with this, we can come to the 33rd question that states, are there any disadvantages, or what are the disadvantages of making use of the model view controller in React? One thing that we've already discussed is a lot of advantages of React in these 33 questions, but then there are certain tiny problems of making use of MVC as well. When you use model view controller, there's 3 steps: modeling, viewing, and then having the controller model all of these together will make sure that there is a slight bit of memory wastage that you have to consider. And then when you have to work with the DOM architecture, manipulating the DOM will actually take a lot of efficiency, take a lot of time as well. And doing this, the application will actually become very slow. There's a lot of dependencies that is created along with React in the case of MVC, and if you have to combine all of it together and give one big disadvantage is the model complexity will increase a lot. So for a developer, it will increase a lot in terms of workability, and for React as a framework, it will decrease its efficiency, make it very slow, and add a lot of dependencies which basically give you more probability of the application failing or something not going right. So in terms of you as a developer, there are certain disadvantages you have to consider, and then React as a framework again comes with tiny bit of disadvantages, as you can see on your screen.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of React.js by answering this question. What is React.js? A. Server-side framework. B. User interface framework. C. A library for building interaction interfaces. D. None of these. Comment your answers in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
Now we can check out the 34th question that states, what are pure components in React? Pure components we have checked out, stateful components are done. So pure components are similar entities. They're actually singular entities, that are actually written in React. So what happens is that they are fast, they're simple to write, they have the ability to replace any other general component that you might have. And the only important thing is that it has to have a render function attached to it, because if you cannot render a new component, it is deemed useless. So to do this, you might be wondering, okay, can we use the regular component itself? So why do we require pure component at all? Well, a pure component is used only to make sure you keep the application workability high, to keep the efficiency and performance high while keeping the code same. So since these are singular entities, right, so they can be wrapped around in themselves and they can be independently stored, independently worked on, and not have any sort of dependencies outside of the rendering ability as well. So in that particular case, when we talk about simplicity, ease of use, and how good it is for both the developer and the application, pure components wins. So after understanding pure components, we need to check out where HOCs are used. HOCs are higher order components, and we've already discussed this in a previous question. So HOCs are put to use very much whenever there's a requirement for code reusability, or let's say you have to hijack a render method, or if you have to manipulate a state and work with abstraction, and then of course if you have to manipulate properties, or if you have to work with Bootstrap abstraction as well. So to be honest with you, there's a lot of applications where HOCs are put into effective use in React, but then you can mention 5 or 6 where they're the most effective and add the most value. And this of course will power up your answer as well. So manipulation of props, state manipulating, render hijacking, code reusability, and where there's a requirement where you have to work with Bootstrap abstraction as well. So these are some of the very important tasks that HOCs are put in use for. Coming to the 36th question, it states, what are keys in React? So as the name itself suggests, keys are actually used to keep a track of something here. So what is that something? Well, here we'll be checking all of the items and tracking changes on these particular entities actively. So what happens is that they used to check if an item has been added or if it's been removed in a list or not. So only to check the presence or the absence of these items in the list, we use an entity called as keys. And there's a small simple syntax on your screen which shows the usage of keys in React. So again, just as with any other question that we've been talking about, if there is a situation where you can provide a very simple code snippet or a syntax snippet where you can explain your answer better, please make sure to do that for all the questions as well. So if your question can fit a quick syntax or a quick dirty piece of code, guys, please make sure to do it, as this will add a lot of value to your candidature in that particular company as well. So understanding that, we can move to the 37th question, which states, differentiate between controlled component and an uncontrolled component in React. A controlled component, as the name suggests, is actually a component in which React can do whatever it wants on it. So React has complete control of it, and there is a singular point of data for the forms where you have to perform state changes, get it re-rendered, and all of that. When we talk about uncontrolled components, here it's very important difference is that the data gets handled by the DOM and not the React component itself. So React does not have complete control over this component. And how is this done? This is done by making use of refs in React, as we already checked out, right? So if you have to implement and handle third-party DOMs, if you remember, that was point number 4, I think. Yeah, so this is where it's used. And an uncontrolled components, while being handled by a DOM and not React, has its own advantages and disadvantages. Now, coming to the 38th question, it states, how can you tell React to build in the production mode, right? So what is the simple way of you conveying to React to move to the production mode? So you can actually directly code in production mode, but then to do it, you have to set one very, very simple variable. It's called as the environment variable, and then it's process.env.node_env, and you have to set this variable to production. And one very important thing that you do have to note is that once React is put into production, right? So if there is any other developmental features that you have, or let's say if there are any warnings, all of these are not shown in the production mode. So this is something which is very important for you to mention in the interviews as well. So it's as simple as setting an environment variable. Now with this, we'll come to question number 39 that states, what is the difference between clone element and create element in React? So what is the clone element and what is the create element, right? So clone element, again, since React is highly readable, you can already tell by its name, it is used to clone an element and pass it to new properties directly. With create element is an entity where all the JavaScript XML files get converted and gets compiled and converted into a format where it is understandable by the browser, and then this is also used to create elements inside React itself. So create elements will help in the actual creation of elements in React, and of course to help in JSX files getting compiled as well. And clone elements clones the element and then passes it on directly to new props. So guys, with this we come to the 40th question that states, what is the use of the second argument that is passed on to set state? So we have something called a set state and we have a second argument that goes to it. So is this second argument optional or not? Well, the answer to it is that, whenever set state is actually finished, there is a callback function that gets invoked, and then all of the components here gets re-rendered in React to make sure that, the latest render is shown to the user. So with this, when we make use of set state, we have a second argument there. So the interviewer is trying to ask you if it's an optional argument that you pass. The answer is yes. Since set state is actually an asynchronous function, what it does is that it takes in just another callback function and works normally. So, even though it seems very simple to directly do this, a clever programming practice, a standard good governance programming practice will always tell you to make sure to use another lifecycle method instead of directly passing it via the optional argument as well. I mean, there are multiple reasons to do this, but then they are not in the scope of this answer. So when you asked about if it's optional or not, make sure you answer yes. And why is it optional? Because it is asynchronous and it can handle the same thing in another callback function as well. So with this, guys, we come to question number 41. So the 41st question states, is there any way to avoid the requirement of making use of binding whenever we make use of React? The simple answer to this is yes, we can actually avoid binding when we're making use of React, and it is done in two ways. One is that you can define an event handler as an inline arrow function, the arrow function that we discussed in the previous couple of questions, and then secondly, you can make use of a function component and use it with hooks to make sure that you do not have to bind any component to each other and work with it as well. So either making use of the arrow function or by making use of hooks, you can avoid the need of binding in React. So moving on to the next question, it states, what is the strict mode component that is used in React? So whenever we talk about strict mode component, one major thing that you have to know is its advantage and why is it used. So, whenever we create any new code bases where you have to understand what components are being used there, right? The strict mode components are immensely beneficial for this. Whenever we talk about in terms of debuggability, there it will help as well, because if we can solve the problem faster whenever we wrap it with any other component, it will of course solve it quicker, because that would be the one causing the problem, and we've just wrapped it with another component and then worked with it, right? So the strict mode component is used for two things: one, in the creation of new code bases, and second, to be wrapped around other components to provide easy debuggability. So make sure that you mention these 2 points. With this, we can come to question number 43 that states, what would you do if your React application is rendering slowly? Again, this is a question which is very, very, very commonly asked, and then guys, pay attention on this one. So why do you think, rendering is slow in React, right? So the most simple answer to why rendering is slow in React can be answered in the way where, because there are so many re-rendering operations that are being done. Sometimes they're necessary, of course, if you have a very large applications, but then most of the time these re-renderings can be unnecessary and redundant. So there are two main tools that React will give you where you can check this and fix this. One is React.memo function, where you can prevent all of the unnecessary re-renderings that takes place, and whatever the function components does, you can actually find what is the rendering that is not required to be done and then remove it as well. And then you have the pure components. Of course, pure components is put into place to make sure that you remove all of the unnecessary rendering in any of the class components. So in both the ways, with respect to function components and class components, React does provide a way for users to make sure to remove redundancy in terms of re-rendering, as you can see on your screen. So make sure to mention react.memo and its usage for function components and pure components in a way where we're talking about removing redundancy with respect to class components. So with this, we move on to question number 44 that states, can you conditionally add attributes to components in React? The answer is yes, you can add attributes to React whenever there are certain conditions that are met. One thing you have to know is that React has the ability to completely omit an attribute if the value is passed to it is not true, right? I mean, logically speaking, this is supposed to be done, automatically, but then many of the programming frameworks does not do this, and React has advantages in this way as well. It can completely omit an attribute if the value that is passed over it at the end of the day is not true at all. Now check out the simple example that's given on your screen to see how you can conditionally add attributes to components, right? So we have var condition equal to 2, var component, we have the div value is foo, and then we've easily added an attribute to the component there to further make use of it, right? So if the condition is met, then yes, you can add attributes to it, and that is shown in the example on your screen. Coming to question number 45, why is props passed to the super function in React? So when we talk about properties, again, all the properties are passed on to the super functions if and only if the user wants to make use of this.props. So if the user has a requirement to make use of this.props in the constructor, only then will the props get passed on to the super function. So it can be shown on the screen in the example that you're seeing right now. So when you talk about the constructor there, we're extending the React component and we have the constructor of props. So once you've made use of the constructor there, we're going to use this.props, right? So once you have to use it and once it is passed to the super function to have access to this.props, we make use of the super function, guys. So coming to question number 46. Question number 46 states, what is the difference between the get initial state and the constructors in React? You have to understand that whenever we make use of ES6, right? So users have to actually manually initialize the state in the constructor, and then to do this, to manually initialize the state, we have the get initial state function. This method is actually defined by the user and worked on as well. So this is done very, very easily, as shown in the example on your screen, guys. So check it out. So we have the constructor props, you have the super function, and instead of calling this.state, so we have manually defined the state, right? So this dot state, and we have given a comment there calling it initial state. So if you want the ability to go on to do this, you will have to use get initial states instead of direct constructors as shown here. And then when we come to question number 47, it talks about the predefined prop types that are present in React. You do not have to explain all of the prop types that are present here, the properties. In fact, you can mention them and then be good with it. So there are actually 5 very important properties, predefined property types in React as shown on your screen. One is the bool, one is the functions, the other one is the nodes. We have number and string. Of course, React.PropTypes.bool, func, node, number and string are the predefined prop types that are present in React. Again, all of these properties are used for their own niche applications, but at the end of the day, it is very important that you know this and you show the interviewer that you know that there are these predefined prop types that exist in React. So with this, we can move on to the 48th question, which states, what is React Fiber? Well, React Fiber is a new engine in React. So it is actually the re-implementation core algorithm that comes along with React 16. So one of the main important goals of React Fiber is to make sure that there are incremental rendering facilities given for the virtual DOM itself. Why is this done? Again, the primary talk here is about efficiency as well. So whenever you have to render, let's say, any gestures, animations or anything of that sort, this will make sure that it will help in giving the right priority to what updates need to happen at what point of time. So again, this way there is no delay or there is no latency in terms of the gap that exists between multiple renders that happen for the DOM as well. So this is why React Fiber is a very important aspect of this. And then we already spoke about hooks. Coming on to what hooks actually are. So question number 49 discusses about what are hooks in React. So hooks again are entities that are used to make use of a state and any other features in one very important condition where you do not have to write a class for them. So hook is actually a new implementation. It came along with the React version 16.8, and here one very important thing is that the stateful logic can be extracted from any component very easily while testing it, while reusing it, repackaging it, and whatever you need without having to write a class specific for it. That is the advantage of hooks. And then this actually implicates that you can do all of these changes to the component hierarchy and all of these actually implicate that, anything can be done here or whatever we mentioned without having to change anything in the component hierarchy as well. So there, re-rendering, re-objectification, all of that is again removed, again working on efficiency, working on easy to use feature that the React framework provides for the users as well. So coming to the last question, the 50th question, we discuss about certifications. So, the question states, have you earned any sort of certification to improve your learning and implementation process in React? Guys, know this. A certification program is not only a bragging right where you say that you're a certified developer, but it'll give you so many advantages in terms of career advancements where, it'll show the interviewer that you're very serious about understanding React, implementing React, and working with it. And if you've picked up a certification program on your own, you're trained on it, it'll also show that you're an effective learner who has the ability to grasp new concepts and learn them effectively and master them at the same time as well. So this either you can be a beginner who's interested in React, who has absolutely no idea of how React works, or if you're a person who's switching from another framework or say a programming language like Python or something and you want to master React, well, of course, yes, that'll add more value to your candidature. So one important thing is that do not get lost in mentioning the certifications that you have or talking about that in detail, but then what importance is given to the answer here is to make sure what you learned from them. So the importance that you have to give here is to talk about the applications or whatever you learned from the program rather than the program itself, right? Because at the end of the day, you learned a program to implement something. Do talk about that implementation. Do talk about the projects and how it has helped you on your journey into understanding and making use of React. Be it in the learning environment, be it in an actual project use case or a production environment, a certification program will give you all the training and the structured learning that is required to make you proficient in React. And of course, it is not only that, there are multiple advantages of having certifications as well. And I'm sure you guys already know this.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides ReactJS online training mentored by industry experts. The course link is given in the description below. So guys, we have come to the end of the session. If you have any doubts, please put down in the comment section below. We will try to answer it as soon as possible. Hope you all enjoyed the session. Thanks for watching.